A Harvard lecture hall freezes as a 12-year-old black boy stands beside the chalkboard, while the professor smirks and tells him this isn't a place for field trip genius tricks. The cameras are rolling, 300 students are watching, and the boy's notebook, taped and worn, shakes in his hands as whispers of "he doesn't belong here" echo through the room. The professor raises his voice, daring him to prove he deserves the seat he was never meant to occupy. And just as the boy lifts the marker, he notices a mistake in the professor's equation that no one else has ever seen, and the room goes silent. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun spilled across Harvard Yard like liquid gold, illuminating the centuries-old bricks and copper spires that towered over students hustling to class. Leaves whispered across sidewalks, carrying the faint echo of a distant breeze. But inside Sanders Theater, the air was heavy with anticipation. This hall had hosted presidents and poets, Nobel laureates and world-changing scholars. Yet on this late September morning, something far less expected, and far more combustible, was about to unfold. At precisely 9:00 a.m., a crowd gathered for Dr. Walter Grimley's famed seminar on advanced theoretical mathematics. The room hummed with soft murmurs of students discussing proofs, publications, and internship offers. A select group of graduate students stood clustered near the marble columns, their notebooks brimming with equations and notes. But just as the clock's minute hand ticked past 9, the heavy oak doors swung open, and everything changed. A boy walked in. He was small, no taller than an 8th grader, but something about his gait held a quiet, unshakable confidence. He wore a faded hoodie 2 sizes too large, scuffed sneakers, and carried a worn notebook wrapped in duct tape. At first the room mistook him for a visitor, an errant sibling of a student, or perhaps a messenger. But as he approached the front row and took a seat in a chair clearly reserved for a visiting fellow, the entire lecture hall froze. Phones lingered in laps. Conversations died mid-word. Sunglasses tilted down. Eyes blinked, then sharpened with disbelief. The boy's name was Jamari Boone. No one knew that yet. For the Harvard students and faculty, he was simply a child, not even a teen, audaciously occupying a seat meant for intellectual equals of the highest caliber. What was he doing here? Who had allowed him in? The question rippled through the auditorium like a venomous whisper. At the far end of the stage stood Dr. Walter Grimley, a man whose reputation for brilliance was rivaled only by his notorious impatience with anything he deemed mediocre. He had taught at Harvard for nearly 20 years, published work that reshaped mathematical discourse, and commanded respect in every room he entered. His presence was magnetic, and yet this morning he felt an unwelcome vibration in his chest, a prelude of disturbance he could neither place nor silence. Grimly watched the boy settle in, his eyes narrowing with an expression that was neither welcoming nor indifferent. It was skepticism sharpened into something almost hostile. A murmur of laughter rippled across the back rows, tentative at first, then swelling into a low hum of disbelief. Jamari did not flinch. He simply looked forward with eyes wide open, yet cluster with a calm intensity that unsettled the room. "Excuse me?" a voice echoed, not from the front but from the auditorium doors. A woman in business attire entered, breathless, holding a heavy envelope tied with a crimson ribbon. She scanned the room until her gaze snapped to the boy. Her hands trembled slightly as she made her way down the aisle, and every step she took caused a fresh wave of confusion to spread among those watching. "Isn't this Harvard?" a student whispered, so low only the person beside him could hear. "Since when can a kid just walk into one of the toughest seminars in the country?" The woman reached the boy, placed the envelope on the seat next to him, and whispered his name, but not quietly enough to escape the ears of those nearby. "Jamari Boone," she said with urgency. "Open it." Jamari took the envelope, his fingers brushing the rough edges of the paper. The auditorium fell so silent, it was as if the world outside ceased to exist. One by one, Grimley's students leaned forward, their eyes locked on the small figure in the corner, curious, cautious, and increasingly bewildered. Finally, the boy carefully untied the crimson ribbon, unfurling the heavy paper to reveal a letter bearing the unmistakable seal of Harvard University. The same deep crimson that echoed the prestige and weight of legacy. The room collectively exhaled, like a football stadium letting out breath before the snap of a play. But this was no game. The woman beside him cleared her throat. "I'm Miss Faulkner, admissions liaison. This invitation was delivered to your foster home in South Memphis. According to the committee, this boy is not here by chance." A ripple of confusion spread. South Memphis, foster home. The words felt out of place in the crystalline environment of Harvard's elite. More than that, they invoked an unexpected discord, the entry of a stranger into a world where strangers were rarely welcomed, and even less often embraced. Students exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others skeptical, as if the syllables foster child were a puzzle they couldn't solve in their minds. Grimly cleared his throat, his voice clipped and measured. This is a mathematics seminar reserved for graduate scholars. Unless this child has something to contribute of academic merit. Before he could finish, Jamari shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze unwavering. He placed one hand atop the worn notebook, tucked into his lap, the one wrapped in duct tape, pages bulging with equations and symbols that even the brightest in that room had never tried. A ripple of realization spread through the crowd. Jamari was not here for a visit. But why? An unspoken curiosity took root, replacing the laughter and disbelief with an uneasy silence. Harvard's brightest minds leaned in, straining to decipher whether this was a performance, a strange prank, or something more profound. Somewhere between uncertainty and awe, the hum of whispered conversations died entirely. The auditorium doors closed behind Miss Faulkner, sealing the room into a bubble of tense expectation. Dr. Grimley exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. His eyes darted between the boy and the sealed envelope lying beside him. If this was some kind of orchestrated disturbance, he would expose it. That much he was certain of. But part of him, buried deep beneath layers of ego and entitlement, felt an unfamiliar tug. A challenge, perhaps. Something that stirred intellect and intuition at the same time. He suppressed the thought, tightening his tie in a gesture so slight, few noticed. But Jamari did. The boy's eyes followed Grimley's hand, and a faint flicker of understanding passed through them. Not arrogance. Not fear. Something resolute. Grimley cleared his throat again. Before we begin, he said in a voice that did not tremble but carried a brittle edge, I'd like an explanation. The lecture hall waited. Students perched on the edge of their seats. Some gripped the arms of chairs. Others stared in stunned fascination. In all of Harvard's illustrious history, few events had ever halted a lecture before it began. Yet here they were, a world-renowned math department, thousands of hours of collective study, all overshadowed by the presence of a 12-year-old black boy from a place they had never expected. Jamari slowly placed his hand on the notebook, his breathing steady but quiet. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times in the dead silence of his mind. I was invited, he said, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable confidence. And I think I can solve today's equation. A collective gasp rippled through the room. But Grimley did not smile. His eyebrows shot up, not with encouragement, but with a suspicion that hid something darker beneath, disbelief laced with a hint of disdain. And in that suspended moment, as Jamari Boone sat in the front row calm and resolute, the entire auditorium knew this would be no ordinary morning. The professor's eyes narrowed, not in welcome but in suspicion, and the room leaned in, bracing for what he would say next. What he said would rewrite the rules of that lecture forever. The atmosphere inside Sanders Theater thickened with tension. Seconds after Jamari Boone spoke, a murmur rippled through the assembled students and faculty. Not the polite, intellectual hum of debate, but something taut and uneasy, like a string stretched too far. Some exchanged glances that betrayed curiosity. Others wore expressions of barely concealed irritation. At the front of the room stood Dr. Walter Grimley, the man whose name appeared on academic journals, lecture halls, and prestigious plaques worldwide. But in that charged moment, nothing about him seemed calm. Not his jaw, not the rigid posture, not the cold glint in his eye. Grimley took a deliberate breath, his mind racing faster than his measured demeanor let on. He studied Jamari, a boy whose presence had shattered the routine of a standard lecture. For Grimley, tradition was sacred. The classroom was where hierarchies of knowledge were respected, where years of methodical study were the ticket to recognition. And yet here was a child, no higher education credited, no background in complex analysis, boldly claiming he could solve today's equation. If this was a stunt, Grimley thought, it was a brilliant one, but his pride recoiled at the mere thought of being outclassed by someone so young. He lifted his chin and spoke, his voice resonating across the room, sharp as a scalpel. Harvard is not a playground, he declared, eyes fixed on Jamari. And this, he gestured toward the boy, is not a field trip. This is advanced theoretical mathematics. If you have something to contribute, then by all means, speak. Otherwise, please remain silent. A ripple of awkward laughter trailed through the lecture hall, the nervous kind that pretended to diffuse tension, but only magnified it. A few students shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh with the professor or recoil at the tone he struck. Grimley's words had been precise, and yet beneath that precision lay a dismissive punch, one that suggested the boy did not belong. Jamari didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, as though he felt anchored in something deeper than the room's collective judgment. The worn notebook rested on his lap, its duct-taped edges like scars of persistence. He opened it slowly, and without a hint of hesitation, turned to a page where neat equations bent and danced across the margins. In that moment, something in the theater changed. Curiosity, rather than mockery, began to take root. Miss Faulkner, who stood just behind Jamari, watched the tension knot tighten. Her lips parted as she glanced between Grimley and the boy she had escorted to Harvard that morning. She had seen disbelief. She had witnessed doubt. But never in her career had she watched a room freeze in such a peculiar blend of scorn and fascination. Her voice, though quiet, carried a firmness that stood out in the reverberating silence. "Grimley," she said, "I believe you should see this." Grimley turned toward her, brows knitting together. His irritation flickered into something more volatile, a mixture of impatience and concern. "Miss Faulkner," he said icily, "this is a mathematics lecture, not a circus. If the boy has evidence of understanding the topic at hand, let him show it. Otherwise, let us proceed with the scheduled seminar." Unfazed, Miss Faulkner took a half step forward. "He does understand, and I think you'll want to look closely." Her gaze drifted toward Jamari, whose fingers traced a series of scribbles that looked to be more than childish doodles. Even the most indifferent students in the back rows leaned forward imperceptibly, drawn by the sudden shift in gravity. What was he writing? Why did it seem to pull the room into a collective breath held too long? Then, in that suspension of disbelief, came a voice from the gallery, low and resonant. "This reminds me of the time I saw Einstein's early notes." A hush followed. The speaker was a visiting postdoctoral fellow, Layla Hastings, known among students for her quiet brilliance and skeptical views of mathematical celebrity. She studied Jamari's page with a slow intensity as though deciphering a secret language. The auditorium seemed to hang on to her every breath. Grimley's eyes narrowed slightly. Irritation at being interrupted, perhaps, but also a flicker of something unfamiliar. Concern. Had a colleague just compared a child's notes to Einstein's? Even Grimley couldn't dismiss the notion offhand. His mind, trained to recognize patterns and proofs, swiveled toward the boy's scribbled pages with a keen interest he didn't want to admit publicly. Jamari lifted his head ever so slightly and met Grimley's gaze across the rows. For an instant, an unspoken exchange passed between them. Grimley saw no arrogance, only a quiet sense of certainty. It was the kind of look a seasoned mathematician gives a problem they know they are on the verge of cracking. But what was a 12-year-old doing staring down one of Harvard's most respected figures with such poise? "I've seen portions of this before," Dr. Hastings murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. But in that still, layered lecture hall, even whispers carried weight. This approach? It's unconventional, but mathematically sound. If he's truly thinking along these lines, we might be witnessing something remarkable. Gasps spread through the room like wildfire. Spectators instinctively turned their heads, exchanged bewildered glances, and shifted in their seats as though the ground beneath them had subtly shifted direction. Conversation started, hushed, rapid, speculative, and soon the collective focus had detached itself entirely from Grimley's opening remarks. The boy in the front row had become the unwitting center of attention. Grimley cleared his throat, his voice cracking just barely, the only hint of discomfort in his otherwise controlled exterior. "Are you suggesting," he began slowly, eyes darting between the notebook and Hastings, "that this child has organically arrived at a mathematical construct previously unseen at this level?" Hastings met Grimley's gaze without hesitation. "That is precisely what I'm suggesting," she replied coolly. "And unless I'm gravely mistaken, he's applying a unique method to approach the equation you posted, one that I haven't encountered in published work." Silence echoed once more, thicker now than before. The auditorium, usually a bastion of intellectual normalcy, now felt like the center of a brewing storm. Those seated near Jamari stared with awe. Others furrowed their brows in skepticism. A few whispered questions that hovered just on the brink of disbelief. Could a 12-year-old be doing what seasoned scholars couldn't? Was this real, or a masterful illusion? Grimley's face remained unreadable, though beneath the practiced control, something churned. Pride, fear, incredulity. He felt them all in rapid succession. What he couldn't feel was surrender. Not here, Not now. He needed to maintain command, not merely of the lecture, but of the narrative unfolding under his roof. He turned toward the class, voice firm and calculated. Very well, he said. Let us examine this further. Jamari, if you believe you are capable of addressing the equation, step forward. For a moment the room fell into a pitched silence, the kind that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. Students sat unmoving. Faculty leaned forward. Even the walls seemed to absorb the tension like ancient sponges soaking up storm water. And then from the very back of the room came a sound that cracked through the stillness, like a lightning strike. A voice, slightly trembling with emotion, yet resolute. Professor, the voice said, this isn't fair. All eyes snapped toward the source. In the back row stood a woman, late 30s, professional in her dress, but her eyes glistened with something that was more than irritation. Her presence was unexpected, yet the entire room sensed the gravity she carried. She held up a second crimson-sealed letter, identical to the one Jamari had received. My name is Denise Boone, she announced, voice steady but charged. I'm his foster mother. I delivered that letter, and this one is addressed to you, Dr. Grimley. A collective intake of breath washed over the room. The audience had thought they understood the situation. A child invited to observe. But now it was clear, the invitation carried a deeper purpose. And whatever it said, it was meant to shift the narrative entirely. Grimley blinked, the first real indication that something had unsettled him. His eyes flicked to the seal, then to Jamari, then back to the woman who had just stood uninvited in front of 300 people. And in that electrifying pause, the lecture hall realized, this was no ordinary academic disruption. Denise Boone unfolded the second letter, her hands trembling slightly, and the room leaned forward as she began to read aloud. What she said next would echo far beyond Harvard's walls. But before her first sentence could fully form, the auditorium lights flickered. An ND screen in the room blazed with a single flashing word. Recording started. Days before the storm inside Sanders Theater, in a corner of South Memphis where cracked pavement met sagging front porches, an ordinary Thursday began like any other. The sunrise there was softer, almost tentative, brushing brick walls and shuttered windows with pale light. Inside one of those aging homes, a place that smelled of laundry detergent and faded wood, 12-year-old Jamari Boone existed in a world far removed from the polished marble and hushed corridors of Harvard. He was accustomed to early mornings, to the sound of worn boards settling, to the distant hum of traffic that never seemed to sleep. Most nights weren't quiet. Most mornings weren't hopeful. Yet on this particular dawn, something extraordinary was about to disrupt that rhythm. Jamari rose before the sun burned hot against the summer air. His routine was simple: make his bed, sweep the floor, and help Miss Denise Boone, not a biological mother, but the woman who had taken him in when life had shown him too little kindness. Denise worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and she carried exhaustion like a weight across her shoulders. Still, she never let that weight press down on Jamari's spirit. Not completely. She teased him about his hoodie, the one with fraying sleeves he refused to discard, and encouraged him to carry his head high, even when the world looked away. That morning, Denise was already gone, her bedroom empty and quiet, the bed still unmade. Jamari remembered hearing the front door click earlier. She left a note on the kitchen counter pinned under a coffee mug. Work early. Don't wait up. Love you. Beneath the mug, a folded envelope caught his eye. Larger than usual, its edges crisp and clean against the yellowed counter. There was no handwriting he recognized. Just a bold, deep red seal stamped in the center, the unmistakable emblem of Harvard University. His heart beat faster. Morning never felt so strange, so immediate, so full of sudden possibility. Jamari stared at the envelope, unsure whether to breathe or hold still, as though either choice might interrupt something momentous. He slid a fingertip across the seal, its texture firm beneath his skin. What could this be? Most letters they received were bills, notices, or reminders of appointments he wished he didn't have, not invitations, not Harvard. His first thought was that it must be a mistake. Maybe someone at school had the same name, though he knew that wasn't likely. The name Jamari Boone wasn't common, and certainly not in a place where his daily life revolved around making ends meet, rather than academic accolades. Yet there it was, printed in clean, crisp font directly beneath the seal. Invitation to attend Harvard University, Advanced Theoretical Studies Seminar. Jamari's breath caught in his chest. His mind raced with images of classrooms far larger than his living room, chalkboards taller than he was, and people who spoke of equations with reverence, People who existed in worlds he'd only glimpsed on borrowed library books, or in the edges of daydreams. But would Harvard really send him an invitation? A boy from South Memphis with torn homework sheets and dreams bigger than his reality. He turned the envelope over in his hands, reading the words again. He read them slowly, savoring the weight of each letter. Something rare and fragile inside him, beginning to thrum with nervous excitement. And then, almost without realizing it, he read them again. "Is this real?" he whispered to the empty room, as though saying the words aloud might summon an answer. Photos of past science fairs, old report cards tucked in his desk, the memory of a teacher telling him he was gifted. All these flashed through his mind like shadows dancing on the walls. The invitation felt unreal, like something you saw only in movies or heard about in stories older people told at dinner tables. But it was here, in his hands, with that seal. A faint creak from the hallway jolted him back into the present. Denise stepped inside, her eyes half closed from fatigue. Her uniform rumpled. She froze when she saw Jamari holding the envelope, her face clearing from mere tiredness into something far sharper: suspicion, concern, disbelief. She didn't speak at first. She simply studied the letter in his hands, watched the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed with a mixture of hope and fear. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. Jamari turned the envelope around, so she could see the seal and the name. "It was here when I got up," he said quietly. "I didn't open it at first." But he paused, unsure what to say next, as though the enormity of the moment made words slippery and hard to grasp. Denise's eyes softened, but only slightly. She took the envelope from him gently, like something delicate that might break. Her fingers brushed his, and for a split second, Jamari saw something flicker in her expression, something like fear, or protectiveness, or both. She sat down at the kitchen table, and broke the seal with a careful precision, as though meddling too forcefully might unravel the fragile promise this letter held. Inside, the paper was thick and elegant, the language formal yet strangely personal. Jamari watched Denise's eyes scan the page, the corners of her mouth tightening, loosening, then tightening again. She read it once, then again, as though the words were too astonishing to absorb all at once. The letter congratulated him on his exceptional work in mathematics, noting that his name and submissions had been identified by a selection committee at Harvard. It extended an invitation for him to attend an advanced seminar series, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for which travel, accommodation, and full participation would be provided. Denise looked up, her face a mask of emotions: pride, disbelief, fear, and something tender that almost cracked her guarded exterior. "This is extraordinary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Jamari, why you? Who would nominate you for something like this?" Jamari's eyes drifted toward his notebook, tucked away in the corner of the room. The duct-taped companion to his thoughts, his endless scribbles of number patterns and theorems, the one thing in his life that felt less like a crutch and more like a truth. He hesitated, then said, "I don't know, but maybe someone saw what I've been doing. Maybe someone believed in it." Denise studied him for a long moment, her gaze lingering on his earnest face, a face molded by hardship, resilience, and a hunger for learning that life rarely rewarded. She reached out a hand and placed it gently on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice steady despite the shock simmering beneath it. "But we have to be careful. Opportunities like this, they can change your life. Or they can break you." Jamari nodded slowly, feeling a mix of exhilaration and dread that he had never experienced before. He had dreamed of moments like this, not in grand sweeping terms, but in fragments: a blackboard with his equations filling it, recognition from someone greater than a neighborhood teacher, his name spoken with respect rather than pity. Still, he couldn't ignore the knot of uncertainty tightening in his stomach. What if it was a mistake? What if someone had sent this by accident? Or worse, what if it wasn't meant to honor him at all? Denise refolded the letter and handed it back to him. "Read it again," she said softly. "But read it carefully. Sometimes things that look like blessings at first glance aren't what they seem." Jamari did as she asked, his eyes moving slowly over the printed words once more. Each line felt heavier this time, as though the letter was a bridge between two worlds. The world he knew, and one he had never imagined entering. His heartbeat thudded loudly in his chest, and for a moment the only sound in the room was that rhythm, pulsing with equal parts fear and wonder. He finished reading, and set the letter down on the chipped table. "Is this real?" he whispered again, the same question he had asked earlier, but now spoken with a greater weight, as though asking it might summon an answer the universe had been waiting to reveal. Denise looked at him and smiled. A small gesture but genuine. "I think it's real," she said. "But let's find out who sent it. If someone believed in you enough to nominate you for this, then we need to know their intentions." Jamari nodded, feeling a strange kind of resolve settle inside him. Uncertainty still hovered, but now it was bound with possibility. A possibility that went far beyond the cracked floors of South Memphis and the ordinary mornings he had always known. Whatever lay ahead, this letter was the first step, the doorway into something bigger, something that might defy every expectation anyone had ever placed on him. He stood up, folded the letter carefully, and tucked it into his backpack alongside his duct-taped notebook. As he did, a single thought struck him, one that felt heavier, sharper, and far more real than anything he'd felt that morning. What if this invitation was meant to change more than his future? What if it was meant to expose something Harvard never wanted the world to see? He whispered those words softly, not out loud, but in the place where fear and hope coexisted, trembling with possibility. Jamari read the letter twice, and as he did, a final sentence at the bottom, written in tiny red ink script, made his breath stop cold. "Your presence is requested not just for attendance, but for contribution." What did that mean? And who had truly sent the letter? The answer would shatter expectations. But first, he had to get to Harvard. The bus station in South Memphis buzzed with dusty engines, rattling benches, and the scent of late summer heat clinging to hurried travelers. Jamari Boone stood alone beneath the aging canopy, clutching a single trash bag filled with his clothes and, tucked inside, his beloved notebook, the one bound in duct tape that had become both his refuge and his proof of existence. No suitcase, no tablet, nothing that screamed privilege, just him, and the weight of an invitation that had bent the axis of his world. People passed by without looking, their eyes drifting over his slight frame, as though he were part of the backdrop, the cracked pavement, the faded paint, the humming insects hanging in the heavy air. He didn't mind. He had learned long ago not to expect attention, to move through the world like a ghost, until something or someone gave him purpose. But the invitation did. It had thrust him onto a stage far beyond his familiar streets, and the bus parked in front of him now was the first step into an unknown he wasn't sure he was prepared for, even as he felt strangely drawn to it. The bus driver, a woman with speckled gray hair and eyes sharp enough to see more than most adults cared to notice, looked at Jamari with a mixture of curiosity and goodwill. She didn't ask questions. She simply watched him climb aboard, trash bag in hand like a young pilgrim carrying all earthly possessions. When Jamari found a seat near the back, the driver didn't offer comfort, but she gave him a nod as if acknowledging the courage it took for someone his age to embark on this journey alone. The engine rumbled to life. The bus lurched forward, and as it pulled out of the station, Jamari pressed his forehead against the cool window, watching the familiar streets melt behind him like fading memories. South Memphis dissolved into highway, and the summer light blurred into streaks of possibility and fear. Every mile felt like a small fracture in his old life. Every passing signpost seemed to whisper that nothing would ever be the same again. He stared down at the duct-taped notebook resting on his lap. Its creased cover bore the marks of relentless nights, the nights he had stayed awake, scribbling equations until the edges of the page blurred into exhaustion. This notebook was where he lived his truest self, where each symbol was a breath and every unsolved theorem a secret longing. And now it was the only piece of certainty he carried with him into the unknown. Other passengers slept or dozed, their heads bobbing against windows that caught fragmented reflections of a world outside. Jamari remained awake, heart drumming a steady rhythm that matched the bus's tires on asphalt. He could feel the distance growing between his past and his future, a future that, until days earlier, existed only as a whisper in his mind, tucked between dreams of chalkboards and sprawling trees. He reached into his bag and pulled out the invitation again, reading the elegant script one more time. "Your presence is requested not just for attendance, but for contribution." The words pulsed in his chest, heavy with meaning he wasn't yet equipped to understand. Attendance meant showing up, contribution meant belonging. But belonging was something he had never known in all his 12 years. Not in schools that overlooked him, not in neighborhoods that saw him as just another kid with a big dream. The bus rolled across state lines, and the sky above shifted from late afternoon gold to bruised blues of early evening. Jamari felt the tension rise in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and fear that curled around his thoughts like creeping vines. He opened his notebook and flipped to the first page of current proofs, lines of symbols that twisted and folded into patterns both elegant and elusive. He was searching for answers, not just to unsolved problems, but to something deeper. Why his mind, so often dismissed in classrooms, found clarity in places others rarely looked. He paused at the second page. Then he blinked, and his breath caught. 3 equations there, scribbled once in a late-night sprawl, were not just unfinished. They were incorrect in the way Ivy League minds, in exhaustive pursuit, had been assuming for years. Patterns that had frustrated doctoral candidates, riddles that had defied peer review, and right there in his small handwriting lay corrections. Elegant, unexpected, and undeniable. For a long moment the bus's engine and passing terrain faded into insignificance. Jamari's pulse, and the rhythm of those 3 corrected proofs, became the only markers of reality. His stomach twisted, not with fear but with a kind of stunned disbelief. He had thought these were simply exercises, abstract puzzles he used to distract his mind from a world that rarely offered answers. But here they were, resolutions not yet seen by the scholars he would soon meet. What did this mean? Was he imagining something real? Was he overreaching? Or had his mind, sharp and tireless, unlocked something even Harvard's brightest had overlooked? His thoughts tumbled into tumultuous silence. The bus rattled onward, unaware that a quiet revolution had just unfolded in the hands of a boy whose life had always been measured in survival rather than accolades. Hours passed, and the sky deepened to a velvety night. Streetlights flickered to life along highways, and distant cities cast a hazy glow on the horizon. Jamari closed his notebook gently, as if afraid that opening it again might shatter the fragile truth he had just uncovered. He laid his head back against the seat, closing his eyes but not really sleeping. Too many questions spiraled behind his eyelids. How would Harvard react when they saw his work? Would they see brilliance, or would they see an anomaly, an aberration that didn't fit their expectations of age, background, or identity? Was he prepared for skepticism, or worse, ridicule rooted not in his ideas but in who he was? His mind drifted back to Denise, to her protective gaze when she first read that invitation aloud. She had warned him about opportunities that could break you as easily as they could change your life. Yet here he was, halfway across the country, suspended between what he knew and what he hoped was possible. Minutes turned into hours, and the bus hummed steadily beneath the vast black sky. Jamari opened his eyes again, scanning the dimly lit aisle, and the silent faces of strangers, napping in the night. None of them knew he was carrying more than a trash bag and a notebook filled with night-born dreams. None could guess that in that duct-tape spine lay solutions that could unsettle even the most entrenched halls of academic power. At one stop, someone climbed aboard, an older man in a tweed jacket, eyes attentive, gaze sharp like he noticed everything without speaking. He sat across from Jamari and didn't say a word, but his presence seemed purposeful, almost as though he had been waiting for someone like him. The man's eyes drifted toward Jamari's notebook, then quickly away, as if respecting boundaries he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. Still, his gaze lingered longer than courtesy required. Jamari felt the old instinct flare, the awareness of being watched, judged, measured. But this time, it wasn't hostility, it was curiosity. Something in the man's expression was more complicated than mere observation. It was recognition. A recognition not of a boy, but of potential. When the man finally spoke, his voice was low and quiet, almost lost amid the whir of the bus. "You're headed somewhere important," he said. Not a question but a statement. "I can tell." Jamari looked at him warily, unsure if the driver had leaked the destination, or if this stranger simply saw something he couldn't articulate. "I'm going to Harvard," Jamari said, his voice steady but cautious. The man nodded. "I know, but do you know why they want you there?" Jamari blinked at the question. He wanted to resist, to retreat into the safety of silence. But something in the man's expression held a strange, unsettling certainty. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something like expectation. Before Jamari could answer, the lights inside the bus flickered again, and the engine's hum seemed to pulse with an energy that felt anything but ordinary. Outside the window, the world was a blur of dark fields and distant lights. But inside, something shifted, as though the very air around him sensed the magnitude of what lay ahead. The old man leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "You're not just going to attend," he said. "You're going to change something. Something no one sees yet." Jamari blinked, speechless. The words felt like a breeze stirring embers, a hint of warmth wrapped in danger. And then as the bus rumbled onward toward a future no longer ordinary, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in paper, then placed it gently in Jamari's hand, before disappearing into the shadows of the aisle. Jamari unfolded it. Inside was a slip of paper, white, unremarkable, but printed on it were three simple words that made his breath stop. Solve it first. Jamari's eyes widened as he stared at the words. Solve it first. What was it referring to? A challenge? A warning? And what truth lay waiting back in his notebook? The one already holding corrections to Ivy League errors. The answer would not just change his journey, it would rewrite the rules of what came next. The morning after Jamari's arrival, Sanders Theater was packed beyond capacity. Rumors had spread across campus overnight, quiet whispers in dorm halls, frantic texts in study groups, and murmured debates over coffee. Did you see what he did on the bus? Is it true he corrected major errors? Why would Harvard summon a 12-year-old? By the time students and faculty filed in, the air was taut with expectation, skepticism, and an undercurrent of something harsher, judgment disguised as incredulity. No one, not even the most seasoned scholars, could recall a day like this in Harvard's history. Dr. Walter Grimley stood at the front of the room, his crisp white shirt pressed tight over his chest, as though he were bracing himself against an unseen gust. There was no warmth in his eyes this morning, only a brittle, calculated stillness. He cleared his throat and surveyed the crowd, his gaze sharp enough to carve a path through the most hardened skeptic. Behind him the whiteboard gleamed with emptiness, as though waiting for something monumental, or monumental to fail. Today, Grimley began, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. We confront an equation that has withstood every notable attempt from some of the greatest mathematical minds of the 21st. Nobel laureates, Fields Medal recipients, and leading theorists have all offered solutions that upon rigorous review fell short. Not due to lack of intellect, but due to the equation's inherent complexity. He gestured to a symbol that looked like an unreadable constellation of characters. No one's ever cracked it. A collective inhalation swelled across the auditorium, a breath held between disbelief and fascination. Students leaned forward in their seats, notebooks poised, pencils trembling with anticipation. Visiting scholars folded their arms, eyebrows raised, silently daring anyone to speak up. The equation nearly glittered under the overhead lights, like something alive, waiting to humiliate or exalt whoever approached it. Grimly turned to face the class. "Any volunteers?" he asked, a tight smirk appearing on his lips. It was the kind of question that carried less invitation and more challenge, as though he were daring the room to prove him wrong, then savoring the expected failure. Silence fell deep and unbroken. Not even a whisper. Not a single hand rose. Not until from the very front row, a small hand lifted. Slowly, hesitantly, it trembled slightly, not with fear but with an uncertain courage that felt almost fragile under hundreds of scrutinizing eyes. Jamari Boone. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the audience like jagged lightning. Some students leaned back, disbelief etched across their faces. Others searched for hidden cameras, certain they were part of some elaborate prank. A few exchanged uneasy glances that carried an unmistakable undercurrent of mockery, as though they could not fathom the idea that a child might actually understand what seasoned academics could not. Grimley's eyes narrowed. The smirk vanished, replaced by a sharp tension, the kind that heralds a reckoning of ego and reputation. "Mr. Boone," Grimley said slowly, his tone cool, "are you certain you wish to attempt this? You understand this problem has defeated minds far beyond your years." Jamari met his gaze without flinching. There was something in his calmness, a grounded certainty that both unsettled and intrigued the audience. He shifted the notebook in his lap, the familiar weight of its pages grounding him like an anchor. "Yes," he said simply, "I would like to try." A murmur swept the room, low at first, then swelling into a chorus of reactions. Shock, disbelief, skepticism, even ridicule. Yet beneath them all was a current of something else, a begrudging curiosity that refused to be silenced. Could this boy really stand where giants had faltered? Grimly hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the whiteboard as though inviting an unprepared challenger to walk into a storm. The students in the back row instinctively leaned forward, as though proximity might reveal some secret hidden in the symbols scrawled across the board. Jamari rose from his seat, the auditorium watching his every step with breath held tight and eyes unblinking. The floor beneath him felt unusually solid, heavier, more purposeful, like a stage built for historic moments. His steps were measured, each footfall echoing faintly in the vast room. When he reached the front, the whiteboard loomed before him, vast, unyielding, unreadable to anyone who had not lived inside numbers the way he had. He reached for a marker with a steady hand, and for the first time since his arrival, the room fell utterly silent, so silent that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed intrusive. Jamari faced the impossible equation, drew in a slow breath, and placed the marker against the board. An unexpected hush spread, not simply because a child was attempting greatness, but because something about the tension felt magnetic, as though every observer could sense that what happened next would define the very meaning of belief, bias, and brilliance. Jamari began not at the center, but at the margins of the equation, a subtle shift in perspective that went unnoticed by most in the first seconds. His fingers moved across the board with deliberate precision, each stroke of the marker confident, unhesitating. What he wrote was not random. It was like a composer rearranging a symphony, note by note, until a new harmony emerged, not loud, not showy, but profoundly resonant. Grimly watched, jaw tightening imperceptibly. The smirk that once curled his lips was gone, replaced now with an unreadable mask. Some in the crowd leaned closer, their eyes widening as patterns began to emerge on the board. Even those who initially scoffed stood straighter, compelled by something neither spectacle nor spectacle alone could explain. Truth unfolding in real time before their eyes. Whispers grew, starting at the front and rippling toward the back. A ripple of awe surged through the room, like a wave gathering force. Jamari's logic did not unravel the equation, piece by agonized piece. It reframed it. He shifted variables, redefined parameters, and in the space of minutes where time seemed to stretch and compress like a taut thread being pulled, he arrived at a place no one expected. 3 Ivy League mathematicians, quietly observing from a panel of visiting scholars, exchanged looks of stunned recognition. The board was no longer a maze of indecipherable symbols. It had transformed into a coherent resolution, elegant, precise, and undeniably correct. Jamari Boone stood before it, toothbrush legs and all, as though solving one of the most confounding problems of modern mathematics was equivalent to finishing homework before supper. The auditorium was frozen, not with mockery, not with polite applause, but with a reverent, incredulous silence. Faces reflected something unfamiliar in such spaces, genuine wonder. And then, before a single clapping sound could break the tension, Dr. Grimley took a breath so slow, so deliberate, that it felt like the quiet exhale of someone forced to confront an idea they had spent years resisting. His voice, when it came, was lower than expected. Not mocking, not scornful, but raw with something unexpected, uncertainty. "You've corrected this?" he asked, gesturing toward the rearranged symbols as though afraid to speak the truth aloud. Jamari didn't look at him directly. Instead, his eyes met those of the visiting scholars, 3 pairs that reflected awe, disbelief, and something closer to respect. "I think this is a valid solution," he said simply, his tone calm but unshakably confident. A weight hung in the air, thick, electric, and impossibly delicate. This was no longer theoretical conjecture. This was proof, written in the stark white of chalky marker strokes, in the quiet stillness of a room that no longer knew whether to believe what it had just witnessed. Then from the back row, a voice hesitant at first, then rising with undeniable astonishment. He didn't just solve it, he simplified it in a way no one anticipated. The words seeped into the crowd, like a warm current finding its way through stone. Murmurs began to grow, first hesitant, then louder, as if the entire room was trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with every assumption they had ever held about brilliance and the limits of expectation. Grimley's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked down to his own notes, then back to the whiteboard, then to Jamari, a man wrestling with pride, disbelief, and a trembling realization that the narrative he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. And just when it seemed the room might erupt into applause, astonishment, or disbelief, the auditorium lights flickered. Not momentarily, but deliberately. The bright overhead fluorescence dimmed, then cut entirely, plunging the vast hall into darkness. A collective gasp fractured what had been a silent awe, and in the momentary blackout, a single voice, calm yet unnervingly clear, resonated through the darkened theater. "Begin the recording." A hum began at the edges of the room, the sharp mechanical whir of cameras activated remotely. Someone deep inside the theater's shadows had just flipped a switch. Someone was recording everything, and as Jamari's resolved equation held steadfast on the board, the auditorium waited, in darkness, for what would come next. The laughter in Sanders Theater began not as an outright mockery, but as a low ripple-like current, that grew and swelled until it filled the room like smoke. It started with a few students in the mid-rows, nervous chuckles, half-hearted snickers, as though the notion that a 12-year-old could wield a complex mathematical argument felt almost comically impossible. Within seconds, that nervous reaction magnified into outright derision. Cameras lit up like fireflies in a field. Smartphones pointed toward Jamari Boone as though he were nothing more than an oddity, an amusing glitch in an otherwise typical semester. "He's just a kid," someone sneered from the back, the words louder than they should have been in a room filled with intellectuals. A kid, that tiny phrase, so wildly cruel, carried the weight of an entire institution's disbelief. No one questioned competence. They questioned age, and beneath that, something darker, the audacity of a black boy, sitting at the front of one of the most prestigious academic institutions on earth. Mockery wasn't merely amusement. It was a defense mechanism for a community unprepared to see brilliance where it didn't expect brilliance to be. Jamari rose from his seat, his movements measured and calm in contrast to the chaotic laughter winding through the audience. The auditorium, previously a palace of scholarly prestige, had suddenly become an arena of judgment, not only academic, but social. Every camera pointed at him was a tiny judge. Every whispered comment was a stone thrown into a lake of doubt. Yet nothing deterred him. He walked toward the whiteboard with the air of someone long accustomed to walking into storm. His steps were firm, echoing like quiet determination against the polished wood floor. His face showed no fear, only an awareness that everyone present had already decided something about him, and now it was time to challenge that assumption without faltering. The laughter crescendoed into a loud chorus of amusement, the kind that feels instinctive, almost thoughtless. Some students pointed, filming his approach as though expecting embarrassment. A cluster near the back openly mimicked a child's tentative handwriting, chirping like a group of crows. There were whispers about him needing a nap, a snack, a permission slip. The entire atmosphere thickened into something simultaneously incredulous and hostile. It was not the laughter of humor. It was the laughter of disbelief and prejudice taking verbal shape. To many of them, Jamari was a spectacle, the unexpected variable that had intruded into a world where age, privilege, and pedigree had long been shields of assumption. But as he reached for the marker, carried with a confidence few could explain, the room began to change, though no one noticed it at first. Jamari's hand rested against the whiteboard surface, fingers curling gently around the cap. He didn't hesitate, didn't glance sideways, didn't allow the ripple of ridicule to penetrate the stillness he carried within. There was a way he breathed, quiet, unhurried, like someone who had spent years wrestling with abstract symbols in silence, away from voices that told him brilliance didn't belong to him. The auditorium's amusement, its clamor faded into a background buzz, like distant thunder that did not command attention. When he placed the marker against the board and wrote the first symbol, a hush swept across the room, sudden, complete, and utterly unanticipated. It wasn't just bold. It was foreign to the assembled scholars. The symbol he wrote wasn't in their textbook. It wasn't in any graduate syllabus. It looked almost like an idea, a visual representation of thought itself, raw and whole. That solitary mark transformed the board from a chalky abyss of intimidation into a canvas of unexplored possibility. The sound of laughter died instantly, replaced by a tacit stillness pregnant with shock. Students blinked as though something had struck their senses off balance, not merely because the mark was unfamiliar, but because its presence suggested a realm of logic or perception no one in the room had yet considered. The silence that followed was heavier than any cheer, heavier than any debate. It was the silence of collective recalibration, as though the room itself was struggling to reconcile its assumptions with this new reality unfolding before its eyes. Dr. Grimley stood rigid, his entire body seeming to hold its breath along with the auditorium. His gaze was fixed, not with admiration, at least not yet, but with a cautious simmering tension, the kind that erupts when someone with formidable intellect confronts something that shouldn't make sense based on all they've learned, yet undeniably does. The corners of Grimley's mouth tightened, not from derision this time, but from a dawning realization that the ground beneath his authority was shifting. He was a man trained to recognize patterns, but this deviation confounded him. It wasn't merely an alternate approach. It was an innovation outside conventional mathematical frameworks. Students stopped filming. Phones lowered. The laughter had no foothold anymore. In its place rose an intangible sense of stunned attention. Damari didn't speak. His posture was uncluttered, free of theatrics, like a man presenting a truth he already knew, and now was merely unveiling. His gaze remained on the equation before him. The marker glided across the board in fluid, practiced motion, not hurried, not tentative, but resolute and precise. He expanded upon the first symbol, weaving a pattern that felt both familiar and startlingly original, like discovering a hidden room in a house everyone assumed was fully known. The room followed each line he drew in near religious silence. What had been derision turned into cautious curiosity, then into focused attention. Those who had mocked him minutes earlier looked on with faces drained of contempt, replaced by a complexity of thought that resembled awe, uncertainty, and confusion all at once. Some shifted in their seats, others slouched with disbelief, and a few leaned in as though trying to imprint every stroke in their memory. One of the visiting scholars, a woman with a reputation for rigorous critique, nudged her colleague and whispered something low enough only the person beside her could hear. Her eyes stayed glued to the board. For someone whose career depended on scrutiny, her gaze was no longer critical. It was riveted. Jamari's fluid approach was not merely simplifying, it was reframing the entire problem in a language no one thought to use. The tension was electric, not the tension of conflict, but the tension of unanticipated revelation. In spaces like this, revelations peeled back assumptions and exposed something deeper, the fragility of certainty when faced with brilliance that does not conform to expectation. A murmur rose. A single voice behind the front rows, cautious and tentative. Is that correct? Another voice echoed it from the opposite side. Are we interpreting this right? The room did not break into chatter, but the collective intake of breath was unmistakable, like falling snow settling quietly on unexpected ground. Grimly stood still, his jawline taut. He watched each symbol form, his mind calculating, recalibrating, questioning what he had long taken for granted. In that moment, he was neither derisive nor supportive. He was suspended in disbelief, and something more vulnerable. Curiosity tempered with fear. For decades, his career had been a procession of intellectual conquests, victories carved from uncertainty. But now, a moment of possible dethronement loomed before him, carried not by an arrogant rival, but by a boy he had undervalued almost instinctively. Jamari's movements were deliberate. His brow furrowed not with confusion, but with a calm intensity, the intensity of someone who understood the rhythms of equations, the way others might understand a favorite book. Each mark on the board, built on the last, forming a tapestry of logic that extended beyond the original equation, as though he wasn't merely solving the problem as written, but as it ought to be written. The board wasn't just corrected, it was reborn. And then, a sound fractured the growing hush. A sharp intake of breath near the back row, louder than it should have been, searing through the stillness like an unexpected note in a quiet symphony. Every head snapped toward the source. A professor, not grimly, but another faculty member, known for his dismissal of unconventional minds, stood abruptly, eyes wild with disbelief. That symbol, he blurted, voice cracking. That's a rewrite of the fundamental theorem. The room jolted, not because someone spoke, but because the implication of those words crashed into the silence with seismic force. Jamari paused, marker still in hand, gaze briefly shifting toward the speaker. The board behind him wasn't merely solved, it was restructured in a way no one had expected. What he had written was not just a correction, it was a challenge to what they considered foundational. And in that charged moment, the auditorium felt it. A shift in understanding, so profound, that disbelief no longer sufficed. The silence deepened once more, heavy, resonant, and electric with the weight of astonishment. Jamari turned ever so slightly, marker poised at the brink of another symbol, one no one present had the vocabulary to name, and the entire room held its breath as if reality itself had paused to see what he would write next. What emerged from that marker would not just redefine a problem, it would redefine who was allowed to solve it. Laughter had died in Sanders' theater, dissolving into a thick, awestruck silence. What began as mockery now hung on the verge of disbelief, as each symbol Jamari Boone wrote on the whiteboard seemed to bend the rigid architecture of academic certainty. It was no longer a spectacle, it was an unraveling. Gasps rippled through the auditorium, not out of shock that the boy was trying, but that what he was doing made sense. Each curve of chalk, each shift in variable felt like a revelation, as though a long-locked door was being quietly impossibly opened in real time. Scholars leaned forward, eyes wide, as if straining could help them see through the barrier of perception that had eluded them for decades. Jamari didn't rush. His movement was deliberate, calm, and carried the nuance of someone who saw not just the equation, but the story within it, the hidden language of numbers that whispered rather than shouted. The previous derision had faded. Now all attention centered on his hands and the way his eyes flicked between symbols as though each one was a familiar friend. In that moment, he was not a 12-year-old from South Memphis. He was a guide through territories that seasoned scholars had mapped and remapped without ever truly understanding their deeper contours. A hush so profound settled over the room that even the faintest rustle, a turning page, a shifting foot, seemed extravagant. Jamari's movements felt sacred in that stillness. Line by line, he unfolded logic like a scroll, revealing connections no one had seen before. He didn't need to speak. The chalk spoke on his behalf, tracing a path through the equation that felt like watching a master artist paint, each stroke unassumingly simple, yet part of a larger, breathtaking design. Dr. Grimley stood at the side, rigid as a statue carved from the very gravity of the moment. His face, moments ago flushed with defiance, now paled beneath the auditorium's lights. This was no mere correction of a missed step. What Jamari was unveiling was elegant. It was a reframing of the original problem that not only solved it, but redefined its essence. The equation ceased to be a barrier and became a bridge, a passage into a deeper understanding that no one had argued was possible. The audience could feel it. That subtle, almost spiritual shift between confusion and clarity. You could trace it in the soft inhalations, in the sudden awareness that they were no longer spectators of childish ambition, but witnesses to something rare. A moment of intellectual metamorphosis unfolding live. Theatric though the term sounded, there was a sacredness to the atmosphere, a resonance that went beyond academic intrigue into something far more human. In the midst of the unraveling, a soft voice emerged from the back row, low, unguarded, yet unmistakable in its raw excitement. "I think he's rewriting the axiom." The words spread not as chatter, but like a quiet current that electrified those near. Head swivels followed, eyes locked on the board, minds trying to reconcile what they had always believed with what they now had to accept. Up front, visiting scholars, those who had flown in with skepticism barely hidden behind professional courtesy, looked as though their foundational beliefs were being gently, but undeniably, dismantled. One woman bit her lip, eyes brimming with awe, her notebook forgotten on her desk. A man beside her exhaled slowly, as though simply breathing in the revelation was enough to live on for years. But in the silence of recognition, something else began to stir. Unease. Not the discomfort of not understanding, but the raw, gnawing anxiety that accompanies a worldview cracking at its edges. Some professors shifted in their seats. Others crossed and uncrossed their arms, subconsciously. Subtle defensive gestures that betrayed internal conflict. If the old guards of academia could be shaken by symbolic patterns on a board, what did that mean for the certainties they had built their lives upon? Nonetheless, all eyes remained fixed on Jamari. When he placed the final mark, almost an afterthought, yet the fulcrum that balanced the entire structure, an almost imperceptible tremor passed through the room. It wasn't applause, laughter, or whisper. It was a collective intake of breath held tight between disbelief and wonder. In that moment, it felt as though the very air hung in tension, as though gravity paused just long enough to witness what came next. Jamari stepped back slightly, lowering his hand, his gaze sweeping across the transformed equation. There was no triumph in his posture, no flourish, no chest-puffing pride. Instead, there was a quiet, almost meditative stillness, like the moment after an ocean wave breaks and retreats, leaving the shore washed clean and changed. He looked not at himself, not at applause, but at the room, at the faces stunned into realization, at the professors grappling with recalibration, and at Dr. Grimley, whose face had lost its color entirely. A murmur, soft and reverent, flowed from the front toward the back rows. A student in the third row exhaled in awe. He didn't just solve it, he reimagined it. And indeed, that was precisely what had happened. Jamari had not merely answered a question. He had reformulated it into a version that resonated with a more profound underlying harmony, an elegance that most hadn't known was missing until now. Grimley's gaze remained fixed, unblinking, as though he feared closing his eyes for even an instant might undo what he had just seen. His chest rose and fell rapidly, not with panic, but with an internal tempest of emotions. Pride warred with disbelief. Ego struggled with truth. Anger flickered beneath a thin veil of confusion. Here was a child, a boy whose skin, background, and appearance defied every stereotype this institution had internalized, delivering insight that many had spent entire careers chasing without success. The audience watched, enraptured, as Jamari's presence in front of that board carried not just resolution, but transformation. What had been a problem known to frustrate seasoned mathematicians now lay solved, restructured, and radiant, like a puzzle whose final piece fit with natural grace. There was no clamor, only stunned silence, the kind that follows the recognition of something extraordinary unfolding in real time. Then a shift. It began with a single voice, barely above a whisper. "He's too young," followed by another. "This shouldn't be possible." And then others, softer, uneasy, uncertain. What started as admiration began to twist slightly under the weight of entrenched expectation. Not louder, but noticeable. Subtle as the first tremor before an earthquake. Jamari sensed it, though he didn't look directly at those murmuring voices. He simply stood there, calm, steady, as though aware that brilliance often triggers reactionary disbelief before acceptance. Harvard, a temple of intellect, was now revealing its human side, one prone to defensiveness as much as admiration. Grimly finally spoke. His voice low, measured, yet cracking ever so slightly. It was not mockery, nor applause. It was something less defined, an attempt at recalibration. This is remarkable." His eyes flickered toward the whiteboard, then back to Jamari. "But, are you certain this holds under formal proof? Have you considered the implications of this rearrangement on the corollaries?" Before Grimley could conclude, the lights in the auditorium flickered once, twice, then steadied, but not in unison. Some sections glowed warm, others remained dim, like the room itself was unsure whether to embrace the moment or recoil from it. A low hum, almost electrical, vibrated through the walls, as though the very fabric of the room was responding to what had just been set into motion. Then came an unexpected twist. The auditorium screens, previously dark, flickered to life simultaneously, displaying a countdown clock no one had seen before. 1 minute, 55 seconds, 30 seconds. The numbers ticked downward with stark intensity, igniting confusion among the scholars, students and faculty alike. A ripple of nervous energy surged through the room. Some gasped. Some cursed under their breath. A few instinctively reached for their phones. But the display persisted, its origin unclear, its intention even more so. Jamari's eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear but focus. He had solved the equation, yet now seated in a room of collectives who had laughed at him only moments ago. He faced something entirely different, an unknown challenge that followed his triumph with urgency. No one understood. Was it a timed demonstration? A technical error? A prank? Or something far more consequential? A test, perhaps, beyond mere mathematics, designed to provoke a deeper layer of suspicion and reaction. In that suspended moment, the room was no longer merely the site of academic revelation. It was a container of collective tension, uncertainty married with anticipation, as the countdown continued its relentless descent. And then, at exactly 10 seconds remaining, the screens all switched, not to equations, not to applause, but to a message that sliced through the charged silence with chilling precision. Proof accepted. Now defend your logic. A murmur spread, not confusion, but recognition. This was no longer about solving the problem. This was about the judgment of what had been solved. Every eye turned toward Jamari, the boy who had rewritten a century-old mystery live, as the auditorium waited with bated breath for his response. What he said next would determine not just academic acceptance, but whether his brilliance would survive an institution built on certainty and centuries of expectation. The room still hummed with the ghost of astonishment when the countdown vanished from the screens, and silence reclaimed the air. Jamari stood motionless at the front of the auditorium, the whiteboard behind him transformed into a lattice of clarity that only minutes earlier had seemed untouchable. Every mind present felt the gravity of what had unfolded, except for one mind that could not accept it. That resistance pulsed inside Dr. Walter Grimley like a storm waiting for thunder. His expression was unreadable for a moment, then like a glass surface finally cracking. The composure shattered. He stepped forward, his shoes echoing sharply across the polished floor, the sound too aggressive for a room so fragile with revelation. The veins along his neck tightened, his jaw cutting hard lines beneath his skin. He no longer looked like a revered scholar presiding over inquiry. He looked cornered, exposed, and unwilling to face the reflection truth was forcing upon him. The admiration quietly unfolding among the students felt to him like an indictment, as though every breath of awe in the room chipped away at the authority he had spent decades commanding. "This is fraud." The words burst from his mouth before his thoughts could restrain them, slicing through the stillness with a venomous clarity that startled even those closest to him. His hand slammed against the podium with a force that reignited the room's suppressed tension. The sharp crack ricocheted through the auditorium, and the shock of it made a few students flinch, not out of fear but because of the rawness in his voice. It wasn't academic skepticism anymore. It was personal. A hush swept through the space, thicker than before. The intellectual atmosphere dissolved into something more political, more social, more fragile. Jamari remained still at the board, his posture neither defiant nor submissive. He simply existed in the storm, a small figure grounded by the duct-taped notebook beneath his arm, the thin barrier between his inner world and the hostility now choking the air. Dr. Grimley's tone sharpened. His words edged in accusation rather than inquiry. "There is no plausible scenario," he said, each syllable clipped, in which a 12-year-old child produces a restructuring of an equation that leading theorists have debated for decades. His voice rose, not in confidence, but in desperation. "You stole this from somewhere, from some paper, some archive, some obscure publication, and attempted to parade it here as original work." Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, the accusation confirming what they'd always sensed about rooms like this. Brilliance here was only welcomed when it arrived in acceptable packaging. The echoes of bias threaded quietly through the atmosphere, unspoken, yet unmistakable. They didn't question the logic. They questioned the boy who delivered it. Jamari's eyes lowered, not in shame, but in the restrained composure of someone who had been accused before, too many times to still flinch at the sound of disbelief. The words "you stole this" had followed him in schools where teachers mistook giftedness for misbehavior, where creativity looked suspicious because it didn't come from the expected hands. There was a familiar ache inside him now, one that didn't burn. It tightened, slow and heavy, the way grief settles after being felt too many times. Miss Faulkner rose from the aisle, her voice steady yet strained. "Dr. Grimley," she said firmly, "we should approach this as scholars, not gatekeepers. The proper course is to request explanation, not accusation." He ignored her, his gaze fixed on Jamari, accusation hardening into something colder, something rooted not in logic, but in an invisible hierarchy that had been reinforced for generations. "Confess how you copied this," he demanded, his tone slicing through the room like a blade carved from years of unchecked authority. "Show the paper you modeled this from, the author whose work you appropriated. Where did you get this?" The word "confess" lingered in the room like a stain. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort not merely academic. The tone did not resemble scholarly critique. It resembled interrogation. Jamari remained where he stood, his chest rising slowly, his silence deliberate. He was not refusing, he simply refused to shrink. A visiting scholar with silver hair leaned forward, voice calm and analytical. "Walter," he said quietly, "the structure is original. The substitutions alone." Grimly cut him off with a raised hand, his voice dropping into bitter steel. "Original?" he snapped. "No. Convenient. Fabricated. There is no record, no history, no foundation validating that this child developed a methodology that escaped global scholarship. There it was. Not this student. Not this mathematician. This child." The words landed different. Raw, unmistakable, unguarded. Jamari finally spoke, his voice soft, not challenging, not pleading, clear. "I didn't copy it," he said. "It came from here." He tapped lightly against his notebook, an echo of cloth and tape beneath his fingers. "From working through patterns, night after night, for years." His voice did not tremble, but the silence after it did. A student toward the aisle whispered under her breath, "Let him show the notebook." Another nodded, their voices hesitant but sincere. The moment had shifted, no longer spectacle, no longer derision, but a fragile demand for truth. Grimley's expression hardened. "Notebooks can be staged," he said sharply. "Pages inserted, edits fabricated after the fact." His tone grew colder, more pointed. "Children from under-resourced institutions are often coached into academic theater projects, narratives of gifted prodigies designed to provoke sympathy and publicity. I will not let Harvard become a stage for that performance." The room stiffened. That sentence did not sound like critique. It sounded like prejudice disguised as intellect. A wave of discomfort rippled through the auditorium. Even those unsure about Jamari's work now bristled at the open disdain, not against the proof, but against where the boy was from. Jamari took a breath, slow and steady, then unzipped his backpack. He withdrew the old duct-taped notebook, edges frayed, corners bent, its pages thick with the wear of countless revisions. He held it in his small hands like something fragile, yet unbreakable, something that had carried him through long nights when the world outside his window never quieted. "I don't need sympathy," he said quietly. "I only need to show the truth." A hush rolled through the hall. He opened the notebook, not with flourish, not for spectacle, with care. The first page was dense with years-old scribbles, early attempts, hesitant markings, ideas half-found before exhaustion overtook him. The ink faded in places, equations layered like sediment recording growth. Camera lights near the back flicked on instinctively, not the students now, but Harvard's own mounted recording equipment, their red indicators glowing, lenses widening. The image of every page projected across the suspended screens. High resolution, unfiltered, unavoidable. Each page told a story no accusation could erase. There were crossed-out formulas, revised configurations, corrections scribbled over mistakes he had made in his earliest attempts. There were annotations and margins, questions posed to himself like quiet conversations in the night. The handwriting shifted gradually across pages, small at first, hesitant, then bolder, more certain, as his confidence formed through pattern, discovery, failure, persistence. The work was not choreography, it was lived evidence. A professor near the aisle swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "This is longitudinal development," she whispered to no one in particular. "These are iterative leaps. You can't fabricate evolution." But Grimley was not listening to reason anymore. He was losing control of a narrative he had never imagined himself outside of. His fingers curled against the edge of the podium, his pride bleeding into something almost frantic. "Projecting pages doesn't validate authorship," he insisted, though his voice faltered against the force of the unfolding truth. "Anyone can." He stopped mid-sentence, because on one page, one torn halfway down the seam, Jamari had written something in pencil that silenced even his harshest skeptics. A date, 5 years earlier. And beneath it, a line of childlike handwriting. "One day I'll understand why they never see kids like me as smart enough." The sentence struck the room with the force of a confession none of them were prepared to confront. Not Jamari's, their own. The air thickened, not with math, with reckoning. Jamari continued turning pages, not to prove himself, but because the truth was already there, embedded in ink, graphite, smudges, wear, persistence, and quiet isolation. Every symbol reflected nights spent alone at a kitchen table, while the world outside his window forgot him. Each correction, each margin note, documented a journey no stolen work could mimic. A quiet voice rose from the back, trembling, conflicted. "He didn't steal it," it said. "He lived it." The words did not echo. They settled, like truth always does. Jamari reached the most recent pages, the very patterns that sat on Harvard's board now. Their early attempts raw, clumsy, unsure, slowly evolving into the refined architecture behind him. And the cameras, every lens Harvard owned, caught every line, every revision, every wound and triumph bound inside the duct-taped spine. The room did not breathe. Grimly stared, not at the notebook, but at the world collapsing inside himself, at the fragile barrier between doubt and refusal. His pride clawed desperately for footing, yet even it could no longer deny the evidence before him. But denial does not dissolve. It transformed. His eyes hardened, and instead of surrender, he stepped forward. The cameras were still recording when Grimley leaned closer and said, voice taut with simmering fury, "Then tell us who has been feeding you these ideas." The moment Jamari Boone's notebook was projected across the enormous screens in Sanders Theater, an uneasy stillness settled over the room, heavier than any lecture hall had ever known. What had begun as a chaotic swirl of mockery, confusion, and skepticism had by now transformed into something far more uncomfortable, undeniable proof of brilliance. Students who had laughed minutes earlier now sat silent, stunned by the weight of what they were seeing, their phones forgotten in their laps, faces drained of certainty and flushed with awe. Page after page unfolded like chapters of a forgotten chronicle written in ink and graphite, raw evidence of a mind that had not merely grasped complexity, but carved whole pathways through it. There were theories sketched in sprawling networks of logic, algorithms threaded with a kind of intuitive precision few had ever witnessed, and clean lines of pure mathematical reasoning that defied age-based expectation. This was no polished research paper, designed to improve. This was lived mathematics, a chronicle of growth, trial, correction, and revelation born from years of persistent thought in isolation. The auditorium's atmosphere vibrated with changed expectation. No one looked amused anymore. Jamari's story was no longer merely bizarre. It was a demonstrable fact, repeatedly shown, page by page, layer by layer, anchored in the kind of meticulous work that doctoral dissertations were measured against. The smudges on the paper, the crossed-out attempts replaced by refined equations, and the gradual progression of understanding on every sheet. These were not the marks of fabrication. They were echoes of persistence, the kind that cannot be staged or manufactured. A hush, deep and reverent, replaced the laughter. Students leaned toward their neighbors, not to mock, but to whisper incredulously, "Is this real? Did he really do all this?" Every turn of a page deepened their respect, challenged their biases, and pulled them into a reluctant reordering of what they believed brilliance looked like. Here was a boy who had spent nights wrestling with abstractions far beyond the curriculum they agonized over in graduate seminars. Jamari stood still, framed by the glow of the screens, calm and composed. His expression did not betray triumph, only quiet acceptance. The truth was unfolding before them in incontrovertible detail, yet none of them seemed prepared for it. Some students blinked rapidly, trying to reconcile the gulf between expectation and evidence. Others stared in near silence, faces lit by screens showing symbols they had once thought untouchable. In the front row, a visiting PhD candidate, previously skeptical, exhaled audibly. Her voice trembled with awe when she spoke, almost under her breath, but her words carried wider than she intended. He didn't just understand the problem, he expanded. That single thought rippled through the room, collapsing boundaries of disbelief and launching pure intellectual amazement into the open air. Faculty members shifted uneasily in their chairs. Some clutched the edges of desks as though anchoring themselves to a reality that felt too fluid and unsettling. Others stared with admiration, their eyes unblinking, absorbing every detail of Jamari's notebook, like scholars who had just chanced upon lost pages of a foundational text. In that weighty silence, the invisible rope of expectation snapped, and a new narrative was being rewritten in real time. Dr. Grimley stood near the podium, jaw tight, his usual air of authority unsettled, not by what the pages showed, but by who the mind belonged to. He peered at the screen with narrowed eyes, not in accusation now, but in begrudging acknowledgement that every attempt to belittle Jamari's work had been rendered moot. This was not resemblance to brilliance. This was brilliance, living, breathing, undeniable. And yet, for all the validation pouring from pages that shamed every assumption they had ever held, the room was not fully at peace. Some reactions were not of admiration, but of discomfort, not because Jamari's work was less than extraordinary, but because the institution itself was confronting a truth it had never expected to encounter, and one it hadn't built a framework to interpret without bias. As the projected pages continued their silent testimony, a low murmur crept up near the aisles, where older faculty gathered. Their voices were hushed, but layered with tension, not about the math but about what this revelation meant for the institution's identity. Here, cradled in the hands of a boy from an under-resourced background, lay evidence that challenged centuries of tacit assumptions about where genius could be found. Jamari's foster mother, Denise Boone, stood quietly at the back. Her eyes shimmered with emotion, not triumph, but relief. Relief for a child whose existence had always been measured against odds he never asked for. Relief that finally the world could see what she had often glimpsed in him. But beneath that relief lurked an uncomfortable reality. Relief tempered by the knowledge that the world rarely changed without resistance. And resistance was exactly what began to stir next. While students and many faculty members sat transfixed by the notebook's contents, the dean of Harvard's mathematics division, Dr. Elliot Harrington, made his way briskly down the corridor just outside Sanders Theater. He had been summoned earlier that morning by an urgent call from Grimley. The voice on the phone was strained, not with excitement, but with an edge of panic no one in his department had ever heard before. As the dean approached his office, his steps were measured, but his thoughts were racing. He opened the door and stopped cold. On his desk, spread neatly under a single desk lamp, were several printed documents, glowing in the half-lit room. One was Jamari's projected notebook page from the earlier session, printed with meticulous precision. Next to it sat a sealed internal memo bearing the emblem of Harvard University, unopened, untouched, official. Every faculty member who saw those letters knew the seal. It was used only for matters confidential, sensitive, and rarely acknowledged publicly. The dean exhaled, his gaze flicking with unease toward the document. He reached for it, but before he could break the seal, his phone buzzed. A text message that carried only 2 words, "It's happening." The tension in his shoulders tightened. His gaze shifted back to the unopened memo. Something in his gut, decades of experience shaped by institutional preservation, told him this letter was not meant to acknowledge brilliance. It was meant to contain information that could shift power, and not in a way he wanted to be public. He broke the seal. Inside was a brief memo, stamped confidential and marked with a date older than anyone expected. Read Jamari Boone. Review findings and implications. Beneath that title was a list of annotations. Analysis by select committee. Classified evidence of conceptual innovation beyond known frameworks. Recommendations. Restrict external dissemination pending review by oversight board. Potential risk to institutional hierarchy and precedent, if released publicly. Consider pathways to neutralize unintended impact. The dean's breath caught. Neutralize unintended impact. The words seemed cold, antiseptic, like bureaucratic language deliberately shaping a response that avoided truth in favor of institutional preservation. The accusations, phrased so clinically, were designed not to celebrate genius, but to quiet it, to prevent disruption. They were unspoken judgments coded as recommendations. He exhaled slowly, unease coiling in his chest. His gaze slid to the line. Potential risk to institutional hierarchy and precedent. This wasn't merely a matter of academic review. It was damage control. The very success unfolding in Sanders Theater, the brilliant proof in Jamari's notebook that had silenced skeptics and reshaped minds, was now deemed a threat. The dean's eyes darted back to the documents again. The printed notebook pages, the once sealed memo, and the echoing tension of what this meant for the institution, its reputation, its legacy. He had always believed Harvard should be the place where truth rose above status. Yet here was a memo from within his own division that seemed to say otherwise. Protect legacy, even if it meant suppressing revelation. His phone buzzed again. Another message, meet me, now. The dean didn't recognize the number, but he sensed it wasn't random. With a deep breath, he slid the memo back into its envelope, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and closed it with a lingering click, as though closing off the possibility of disclosure before he fully processed what lay within. He walked out of his office toward the auditorium. The doors to Sanders Theater were heavy, black wood, but he opened them anyway, and entered just as the last projected page faded from the screens, and a hum of discussion began to rise. The students' voices were hushed, full of awe. Faculty members stood in clusters, alive with debate. Denise stood near the back, her eyes never leaving her son. Jamari himself was still at the front, serene and composed, the unfolding center of a storm he barely understood. And then the dean stepped forward, clearing his throat. The room quieted. He pulled a document, not the memo, but another page that had been quietly passed to him moments earlier by someone inside the department. A scanned image of another letter. This one addressed to a name no one in the room expected, a name that shook the foundation of who had actually nominated Jamari. Upon seeing the first line, murmurs rippled again. The letter read, "To whom it may concern, this nomination is submitted under Directive Code 0473, ensuring recognition and inclusion of underrepresented intellectual contributions. Underrepresented intellectual contributions." And signed unmistakably, Dr. Walter Grimley. A stunned silence spread. The professor who had accused Jamari of fraud, who had demanded he confess, who had tried to undermine his credibility, was the one who officially nominated him. The room did not breathe. The air felt impossibly thick, as every eye turned toward Grimley, the man whose own handwriting appeared on the directive. A single question loomed larger than any equation. Why would he nominate Jamari, if he never wanted him to succeed? Just when the tension in Sanders Theater seemed impossible to heighten any further, with Jamari's brilliance laid bare, and admiration mixing with an undercurrent of discomfort, a new storm erupted. It began not with another academic critique, but with the soft, ominous ping of an incoming email notification that lit up hundreds of phones and tablets simultaneously. At first, no one paid it much attention. University email alerts were routine, but the subject line, blinking red and bold at the top of inboxes, made stomachs knot instantly. Internal memo, thoughts on recent events. What followed was a sentence that landed like a blow in a quiet room. Black kids don't belong here. The language that followed, verbal vitriol thinly veiled beneath academic phrasing, mocked what it called inner-city IQ stunts, dismissed underrepresented talent as statistical anomalies, and suggested that colleges like Harvard should avoid importing chaos under the guise of diversity. It read as if centuries of bias had been distilled into one unrateably entitled voice. Pandemonium broke out. Harvard University. At first it was disbelief. Students stared at their screens, jaws slack, as though the words on the page had no right to exist in the institution revered for scholarship and supposed inclusivity. Even here, among scholars accustomed to debate and dissent, the explicit cruelty seemed grotesque and misplaced. But disbelief quickly curdled into something far more combustible: outrage. Jamari felt it before he even looked up, a sharp pull in the air, like the instant before a hurricane hits land. Around him, phones lifted, screenshots taken, whispers flared into heated conversations laced with anger and humiliation. What had been a charged academic moment transformed into a deeply personal rupture. Denise stood to the side, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through the message, her lips parted, not to speak, but because the betrayal was so raw it seemed to steal her breath. She saw the faces of other black students in the crowd, wide eyes, blanched cheeks, a collective vulnerability exposed in a place that had momentarily felt safe. Some students pulled out their own phones, forwarding the email to friends not yet present, igniting rapid digital spread. Within minutes, the hateful text had reached every corner of campus, the dining halls, residential dorm groups, faculty lounges, even private messages across prestigious student networks. A hush settled, not the reverent silence of academic discovery, but a stunned, trembling quiet that hovered between shock and hurt. The words "black kids don't belong here" were so raw, so naked in their hostility, that they did more than offend, they reopened wounds that many assumed. Education, especially at elite institutions, had evolved past. Yet here it was, spilled into a virtual forum, where students of color and their allies now sat, reeling with disbelief. The outrage was so instantaneous, it felt like a visible force. Students near Jamari clustered together, huddling like a group of siblings who shared an unexpected trauma. Some sat with their heads in their hands, others stood rigid, fists clenched tightly over phones. Beneath the laughter that had once echoed in this very room, derision once directed at the idea of a child solving equations, now stood a cold, painful confrontation with ugly prejudice that refused to stay hidden behind academic veneers. A circle of astrophysics students, previously on the periphery of the chaos, murmured among themselves, watching their classmates' reactions evolve from shock to indignation to seething frustration. One of them, a first-generation student named Monica, looked directly at Jamari's face, her eyes welling with tears, not because he deserved this hatred, but because she knew something painfully familiar in it. She had seen it in group texts after discussions about race, in glances that lingers too long when she joined study sessions, and in lectures over the years where professors balked at the idea of real inclusion. This email, unsigned, cowardly, but unmistakable, was not an academic critique. It was a dagger meant to belittle, to diminish, to reclaim dominance using old racialized codes. Her voice cracked when she spoke, soft but clear. This is not scholastic debate. This is harassment. By that point, the room was a tempest, tumultuous and boiling with emotional energy. Phones continued to buzz as the message circulated beyond the auditorium, reaching faculty offices and alumni groups. Some professors, previously aloof, now looked horrified, frowning deeply as they read the offensive words on screen. A few whispered among themselves, discussing how to frame official responses that would calm the swelling unrest. Yet others remained silent, eyes averted, as though avoiding acknowledgement might somehow make the words disappear. Denise stepped closer to Jamari, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, both an anchor and a shield against the emotional weight now pressing down on him. She didn't speak, she didn't have to. The pain in her eyes said it all. Rage, disbelief, and heartbreak mixed in a swirl that threatened to consume the room. She squeezed his shoulder, and then pointing to the phone screens around them, she murmured, "This was never just about math, was it?" A slow wave of protest energy began to rise, first in whispers that soon sharpened like rallying cries. Someone in the back murmured, "We should march." Another voice, louder, called out, "We need to make them see us." Suddenly, this was no longer a lecture hall. It was a crucible of social tension, where the personal had become collective, and the academic nature of the debate was overshadowed by something far more urgent. The first spontaneous chant began, low, hesitant, but gaining traction with every beat. "Equal rights. Equal rights." Someone raised a fist. Another voice added, "Black brilliance matters." Within moments, the rising tide of voices converged into a powerful chant that filled every corner of Sanders Theater. In a matter of minutes, what had been a space for intellectual discourse had turned into the birthplace of a campus protest movement. Students leapt to their feet, phones now held high not to record equations, but to broadcast live, broadcasting the angry shouts, the collective pain and the banners hastily scribbled on napkins and notebooks. "No hate at Harvard," one sign read. "We belong here," declared another. "Black brilliance is scholarship." Yet another read, "Respect our minds." The crowd surged toward the doorway, a spontaneous march, not chaotic, but intentional, rising from a current of collective outrage and shared purpose. They flowed down corridors they had walked casually just hours earlier, shouts weaving through the academic calm of the campus like wildfire. Students of all backgrounds joined, some standing in solidarity, others screaming in indignation at the casual cruelty of that email and the implicit assumptions behind it. Professors walked alongside, pulled from offices as the vibration of protest rippled outward. Some held smartphones streaming every chant. Others read the hateful email aloud to passers-by, ensuring that no one could claim ignorance about what had triggered this surge. What had started as a message intended to demean black kids had instead activated a powerful, undeniable force. A unified stand against discrimination in a place that had long prided itself on intellectual merit. The energy was not simply anger. It was determination, hard-edged and unrelenting. What began as a reaction to a hateful email became an assertion of presence. Black students belonged here, and their gifts were not anomalies to be mocked, but contributions to be celebrated. The protest was no longer about an equation on a board. It was about identity, dignity, and truth. But as the throng reached Harvard Yard, chanting and swelling like a wave of sound, there was another signal in motion, one that began quietly, yet now flared on dozens of screens. The timeline of scheduled protests emerging on social media, spreading like wildfire beyond the campus walls. Screens outside Sanders Theater, lit up with text messages, tweets and forwarded links, promising that a protest rally, converging at the John Harvard statue, would begin in just 20 minutes. This was no spontaneous flash protest anymore. It was organized, and at its forefront, printed on banners, chanted from the sidewalks, carried in thousands of voices, was one name: Jamari Boone. Murphy sat beneath the statue, rallying students before they marched toward the Science Center Plaza, when suddenly the screens lit up with a live stream alert that had nothing to do with Harvard's protest. It was from Harvard's own official account, and it was about to broadcast something unexpected, something that would shift the meaning of the protest entirely. The buzz from the protest had barely begun to settle when Jamari Boone's fate was quietly rerouted by an email that disguised retreat as routine. The subject line read simply, "Updated academic status, clarification required," but inside, the language was colder than it appeared. The note from the registrar's office was padded with neutral words: eligibility clarification, documentation misalignment, anticipated reapplication for future cycle, but its intention was sharp, unmistakable, and unspoken. "You were never supposed to be here this long." The email reached Jamari not with a knock on his door, but with a soft ding on his borrowed tablet. He stared at the message, jaw tight, his fingers hovering above the screen. Around him, the dorm room he'd barely had time to claim felt like it was shrinking, four walls suffocating under the weight of polite rejection. The words didn't explicitly say leave, but they didn't need to. It was a logistical brush-off masked as policy. Harvard's polite way of whispering, "Exit quietly, before you embarrass us further." News of the email spread quickly, faster than Harvard could anticipate. Within minutes, screenshots leaked. Students began forwarding the message, their captions dripping with disbelief. Logistics error? Seriously? The irony stung like alcohol on a wound. Only days ago, Jamari had stood in front of the brightest minds on campus, solving an equation that had stumped entire departments, and now, the same institution was folding him into a spreadsheet mistake. The silence from the administration in the hours that followed wasn't accidental. It was strategic. No press release, no acknowledgement, just a quiet digital shove toward the door, a tactic far more dangerous than open rejection. Because this wasn't about correcting an error, it was about restoring control. What Harvard hadn't counted on was how closely the students were watching now. The same lecture hall that once erupted in laughter when Jamari stepped to the board had become the nerve center of resistance. Messages flew in campus forums, private group chats, and encrypted threads. This wasn't just about Jamari anymore. It was about precedent. If he could be dismissed with a vague email after publicly exposing institutional racism and solving legacy equations, then every student who didn't fit the old mold was at risk of becoming the next logistics issue. In the middle of this chaos was Eleanor Rhodes. Eleanor hadn't slept much since the live stream. She had stood beside Jamari when he opened the encrypted files, when the racist emails surfaced, and when the nation finally started listening. She had watched Harvard flinch under the pressure of public exposure, and now she watched them try to rewrite the script in real time. But Eleanor wasn't just watching. She was calculating. Her room looked more like a command center than a dorm. Screens glowed with messages, protest footage, and open documents. Her eyes burned from blue light and fury. She scrolled back through Jamari's original invite email, rereading every sentence. Harvard had made an exception, but not for the reasons they had claimed. Now that the exception had gone public and powerful, they wanted it undone. That's when she saw it. The subtle change. The original invite had come with a file attachment marked Spring Integration Initiative Pilot. But now, when she checked the updated status email Jamari received, that phrase was missing completely. She pulled up the archived version. The attachment was gone. A retroactive deletion, as if Harvard was erasing the very evidence that Jamari had ever been formally invited. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't just removal. It was a cover-up. She bolted upright, grabbed her phone, and typed a single message: "Meet me at Lamont in 10. Urgent." Jamari arrived minutes later, his hoodie pulled low, face tired but focused. He didn't ask questions. He just followed Eleanor up 3 flights of stairs to a rarely used study room, with no cameras. "They're not just trying to send you home," she said without preamble. "They're deleting your tracks." She pulled up the screen, pointing to the missing file reference. Jamari's eyes narrowed as the pieces clicked together. "I always thought they let me in because they saw my work," he murmured. "Now I wonder if they thought I'd stay quiet." Eleanor looked him dead in the eye. "They thought you'd be grateful, silent, disposable. They didn't think you'd light up a national debate on systemic bias. And now that you have, you're a liability." Jamari's silence wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with the weight of betrayal not from strangers, but from an institution that had branded itself as a beacon of excellence. He had come with hope. Now he was being erased, like a clerical error. But Eleanor wasn't done. "They're calling it a review process," she continued, scrolling through the admin response released late that evening. "But they've already revoked your dorm access by next week. They haven't even waited for the process to end." "Wait, what?" Jamari stepped back, visibly shaken. "I checked the housing system. Your student profile is being marked inactive after Friday." Jamari leaned against the desk, head down. "So they're sending me back to Memphis. Back to nothing. Not if we stop them." She said it with a fire he hadn't seen in her before. Not even during the live stream. This wasn't just academic. Eleanor had grown up privileged. Yes, but she had watched how institutions weaponized protocol to protect their image. This wasn't about one student. It was about preserving a system that had never been built for boys like Jamari in the first place. "What if we go public with this too?" she asked. "Expose the email, the dorm access log, the deleted attachment, all of it." Jamari shook his head. "They'll just say I'm a distraction again, that I'm playing victim." "Then we don't make it about you," she replied. "We make it about all the students like you, who never even made it through the gate." As they stared at the screen, the tension in the room thickened. Every decision now felt irreversible. One more leak, one more live stream, and Harvard's carefully constructed image might crack for good. But was Jamari ready for the next wave? He didn't need to answer. His face said it all. Later that night, as Eleanor drafted a new statement, Jamari packed what little he had. Not because he was leaving, but because he wanted to show the world what Harvard had done. On top of his folded clothes sat the notebook, still taped, still filled with genius they tried to dismiss. But as he zipped the bag, his phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. He opened it. A screenshot appeared, one he hadn't seen before. It was a document from Harvard's internal board, labeled confidential. The subject line was chilling. Subject: Boone. Jamari. Threat Perception Assessment. Before Jamari could finish reading, the screen went black, remotely wiped, and 2 words flashed in red across the device. Unfertilized access. Someone inside was watching, and they knew he had seen too much. The night after the emergency campus lockdown alerts spread like wildfire across phones and monitors, the tension on Harvard's campus was electric. Not the buzzing energy of academic pursuit, but the charged current of something far more volatile: collective outrage meeting long-buried truth. What had started as protest chants in the yard had turned into a full-blown confrontation with institutional bias. And that night, 2 unlikely allies stayed awake far past midnight, forging a plan that would ripple far beyond Cambridge. In a cramped student apartment not far from Harvard Square, Eleanor Rhodes, the math prodigy whose voice had arrested an entire crowd earlier that day, opened her laptop with poised urgency. Her face was lit by screens displaying fragments of the racist email, crisis statements from administration, screenshots of Jamari's notebook pages, and a sprawling document titled Bias at Harvard, Internal Logs and Communications. Beside her, tapping furiously, was Jamari Boone, his expression steady but intense. The exhaustion in his eyes was real, but beneath that weariness was something far deeper, the resolve of someone who realized his story had transcended academia and now stood at the crossroads of cultural reckoning. Eleanor glanced at him, then back at the encrypted folder on her screen. "We have to go beyond protest," she said, her voice measured but charged with urgency. "People need to see what's been happening, not just hear about it in news blurbs. See." Her finger hovered over a file labeled Admin Internal Discussions, Bias Indicators. Jamari nodded. "If we can expose what's in these files, without breaking any laws, then the world won't be able to ignore this." His tone was calm but unwavering, like the quiet logic that guided his mathematical proofs. But tonight, there were no symbols to solve, only the raw, complex equation of truth versus prejudice. They worked with an intensity that made minutes feel like suspended moments. Eleanor pulled up old math journals, comparing Jamari's notebook pages line by line with existing academic publications. Each connection they found wasn't just a reflection of his brilliance, it was evidence of originality, a truth that blossomed like a sun breaking through centuries-old cloud cover. The meticulous work that had once been hidden on duct-taped pages in South Memphis was now being deconstructed, verified, and backed with academic rigor. Hours passed in silence, filled only by the tapping of keyboards and the hum of their combined focus. In the background, social media still buzzed with protest live streams and hashtags like Jamari belongs and Harvard bias exposed, but neither Eleanor nor Jamari paid attention. Not yet. This was the core of their strategy, not reaction but documentation, not confrontation, but evidence. Eleanor pulled up a massive dataset she had compiled. Hundreds of screenshots of emails, memos, and anonymous posts pulled from the dark corners of faculty forums, all referring in subtle or overt ways to resistance toward underrepresented brilliance, risk management of disruptive narratives, and the now infamous line from the racist memo, inner-city IQ stunts. These weren't isolated snippets, they were patterns. What if we match these against historical bias indicators? Jamari asked, already imagining the analytical overlay. Not just here, but across Ivy League institutions. Compare language usage over the last decade. No one will be able to deny it, Eleanor agreed. We'll present it like a mathematical proof. Data, patterns, conclusions. She paused. And then we go live. They created a synchronized plan. At exactly 1:00 a.m., Eleanor would start a live stream on TikTok from her verified account, one with thousands of followers due to her academic outreach. At the same time, Jamari would present a short, composed statement explaining why this mattered, not just for one black boy at Harvard, but for every student whose potential had ever been dismissed or minimized by tradition, disguised as rigor. When the clock turned 1:00 a.m., Eleanor sat upright, her eyes scanning the room for one last confirmation. "Ready?" she asked softly. Jamari exhaled. A deep, steady breath, the kind that precedes clarity. "Ready." She tapped go live, and in that instant, a global audience began to stream in, not in thousands, but tens of thousands. The view count climbed swiftly, as notifications around the world pinged into existence. Eleanor Rhodes is live, exposing institutional bias at Harvard, proof and evidence. For the first moments, they began with context, calmly and without accusation, focusing on transparency. Eleanor introduced Jamari, his achievements, the racist email that sparked the protests, and the subsequent administrative attempts to erase him. Her voice was firm, her tone measured, but beneath it was a righteous urgency that could not be mistaken. Jamari's image appeared beside hers, his posture composed, eyes steady and kind. He didn't speak of hate or grievance. Instead, he spoke of truth, of evidence, opportunity, and the pain of brilliance met with dismissal. What he said was not just eloquent, it was human. He spoke of nights spent at a kitchen table with a notebook bound in duct tape. He spoke of patterns and persistence. He spoke of expectation and denial. And then Eleanor opened the first file, the internal correspondence. The racist email, the bureaucratic logistics error, the memo highlighting, neutralizing unintended impact. Watching those documents flicker across millions of screens, people didn't just see words, they saw intent, pattern, resistance, and the chill of denial that so often follows brilliance, that doesn't fit preconceived molds. The chat exploded. Viewers poured in at an exponential rate. Users from across the globe typed messages of support. "This is important. We see you. Harvard needs accountability." Screens filled with tags and shares as clips from the livestream were clipped and reposted, the narrative rapidly expanding beyond a single platform. And then came something neither Eleanor nor Jamari had anticipated. The first notice from TikTok administrators, not to stop the live stream, but a verification boost, a badge marking the broadcast as educational and investigative reporting. The count surged. 50, then 100, then 500,000 viewers in minutes. This was no longer a campus issue. It had become viral, unstoppable, a cultural moment. But the momentum didn't stop there. Within 30 minutes, calls for solidarity poured in from professors at institutions around the world. Academics who had watched the evolving crisis and recognized the pattern of institutional resistance in their own domains. Some issued statements of support, others shared their own stories of exclusion and dismissal. It wasn't just about one boy anymore. It was a movement, a collective critique of academic arrogance. Jamari and Eleanor took a deep breath as the view count ticked into the millions. Messages now streamed faster than human eyes could process. "We want justice. Harvard must respond. This is bigger than you think." Just as Eleanor read a comment that said, "This is going to change everything," a sudden alert flickered on her screen. A separate tab notified them that Harvard's official website had posted an urgent press release, and it wasn't what anyone expected. The live stream viewers held their breath as Eleanor pulled up the page. The message was bold, in large red text. "Harvard University responds. Independent review board formed to investigate allegations. No final conclusions reached." At first glance, it looked procedural. An attempt to show action without accountability. But as the live stream audience read further, the real shock came into focus. Buried deep in the announcement was language that no one thought Harvard would publicly admit under pressure. Preliminary findings suggest patterns of systemic bias that may have impacted institutional decisions regarding student opportunity and inclusion. Harvard University is committed to transparent review and restorative action, and will extend invites to community representatives, including Mr. Jamari Boone and Ms. Eleanor Rhodes, to serve on the oversight board. The chat exploded. Millions of viewers tried to process what they had just read. For the first time in its storied history, Harvard, forced by public pressure, had not just acknowledged institutional bias, but admitted a possibility of systemic impact, and invited the very individuals whose struggle had exposed it to serve on an oversight board. The live stream erupted with comments. Did Harvard just concede? They have to be held accountable. This is historic. Jamari's eyes met Eleanor's, both stunned, both uncertain, both aware that the universe of possibility had just expanded in ways neither could have predicted that night, when they began compiling files. They had gone live to expose evidence, to demand truth. They hadn't expected admission of systemic bias from one of the world's most prestigious institutions. And yet, here it was. But then came another alert, from Eleanor's phone. This one not a notification, but a message from a number she didn't recognize. "If you want real transparency, check the original nomination file. What Harvard released isn't the full record." Eleanor read it aloud, her voice steady but tinged with surprise. Jamari leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly. The live stream chat went silent for the first time in hours, because millions of viewers suddenly sensed that the narrative was about to get even deeper. As Eleanor clicked open a second encrypted file that Harvard had not released publicly, a single line of text buried beneath stamped notation and dated weeks before Jamari's invitation made both of them freeze. Directive 0473, Conditional Inclusion. Remove upon threat assessment. What did that mean? And who had issued it? And why? The answer was about to reshape everything they thought they knew. The story of Jamari Boone didn't stay confined to Wardour Yard. Within hours of Eleanor Rhodes and Jamari's midnight live stream, exposing the university's internal memos and systemic bias, the narrative exploded across national platforms, from educational forums to civil rights caucuses, from academic blogs to mainstream news outlets. What had once been a campus controversy transformed into a national conversation. Experts, activists, and lawmakers began weighing in with a force that no one at Harvard's administration could have anticipated. By dawn, the live stream had been reshared on every major platform. Clips of Jamari calmly explaining his journey, From math notebooks taped together in South Memphis, to challenging entrenched institutional norms, resonated with millions. Mathematicians outside Harvard echoed support online, confirming the originality and depth of Jamari's work. They praised not only his solution, but the methodology he had developed, a framework that wasn't merely correct, but genuinely inventive, allowing insights that experts admitted had eluded them for years. This wasn't teenage flair or idle talent. This was mathematics reshaped by a fresh, unconventional mind. Academics began tweeting and publishing threads that parsed Jamari's concepts, some estimating that if his approach were examined formally by professional peer review boards, it could redefine existing narratives in theoretical mathematics. News outlets from education-focused journals to mainstream channels covered the story, with headlines like "The Boy Who Redrew the Lines of Mathematical Thought." Articles didn't just hail his brilliance, they questioned why an institution like Harvard had resisted rather than embraced him. Scholars pointed out that the very system designed to foster intellectual growth had nearly silenced one of its most original minds. Within this national spotlight, conversations about access, equity, and institutional gatekeeping surged. Civil rights organizations quickly took notice. Leaders from national groups released statements calling Jamari's case a symptom of a broader problem, that despite progress, systemic bias still operated in elite spaces under the guise of academic rigor. Advocates highlighted the racist email and the administration's attempt to push Jamari out as proof that identity and background still weighed unfairly on perception, even in places that prided themselves on meritocracy. The story was no longer about a math problem. It was about who gets to be seen, heard, and valued in spaces historically defined by exclusion. Within 24 hours, lawmakers in Washington began to weigh in. Senators known for championing education reform and civil rights issued statements demanding accountability and transparency from Harvard. One high-profile senator, a senior member of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, told reporters that Jamari's treatment raised critical questions about systemic inequality in elite institutions, and that the committee would soon hold hearings to examine the structural barriers still facing black students within America's educational pipeline. The senator's remarks vaulted the issue into high-level political discourse. Voices that rarely converged, academics, activists, and legislators, now aligned behind the narrative that Jamari's case wasn't just notable because of his brilliance, but because of what his brilliance revealed about power, bias, and opportunity in one of America's oldest and most prestigious institutions. What had begun as a mathematical achievement had become a cultural flashpoint, a lens through which the nation saw itself once again grappling with race, access, and inclusion. Meanwhile, scientists began publishing online endorsements and analyses of Jamari's work. Renowned mathematicians, physicists, and data scientists publicly acknowledged that his solution opened doors to new lines of inquiry, calling his approach elegant and transformative. They discussed how his logic defied conventional frameworks and suggested potential applications in fields far beyond textbook algebra, from computational theory to cosmology. The world was no longer simply watching, it was listening, learning, and reframing assumptions. Within Harvard itself, the impact was seismic. Faculty members who had once quietly questioned Jamari's presence now faced overwhelming pressure to acknowledge his contributions and confront the administration's earlier attempts to dismiss him. Student organizations, black student unions, math clubs, civil rights coalitions began coordinating formal demands. They argued that Jamari's name should be added to lectures, his work incorporated into academic syllabi, his contributions celebrated rather than sidelined. Voices that had been static became forceful, echoing with urgency. At the same time, conservative commentators seized on the controversy from a different angle, framing the situation as a debate about academic standards versus emotional activism. They argued that Jamari's prominence was amplified by social media rather than scholarly consensus, twisting the narrative to fit broader cultural wars about education and equality. In doing so, they inadvertently drew even more attention to the case, forcing it into arenas far beyond academia. Journalists across the political spectrum began interviewing Jamari's teachers from Memphis, students who protested in Harvard Yard, civil rights leaders, and Harvard faculty who supported him. The emails exposed earlier, first dismissed as an isolated incident, were now discussed as evidence of a deeper problem of exclusion and everyday bias. Historians contextualized it, activists energized it, and legislators read into it the ongoing struggle for racial equality in America. Amid this sweeping national reaction, one unexpected voice emerged. A group of senior scientists, published an open letter condemning not just the racist email, but the administrative resistance to Jamari's role in academia. They called for systemic reform, urging universities nationwide to examine their admissions, mentorship and academic support structures to avoid repeating the same patterns. It was no longer enough to celebrate diversity in rhetoric. They argued that institutions needed measurable, accountable frameworks to ensure that all talent was nurtured fairly. And yet, even with all this momentum, national news coverage, civil rights advocacy, Senate interest, scientific acclaim, a darker current was beginning to form beneath the surface. Not all reactions were benevolent. A few faculty members and alumni, those who had once privately questioned Jamari's presence, began circulating counter-narratives. These were not straightforward critiques of mathematics or methodology. Instead, they focused on tone, perceived representation, and institutional optics. Some suggested that the national media attention was performative, that Harvard's reputation was at stake, and that such disruptions could deter future donors. It was a subtle shift from skepticism of Jamari's work to resentment of his impact. It was in this atmosphere that Dr. Walter Grimley, once Jamari's most vocal critic, began to stir. His face, once pale in disbelief, took on a new hardness. The national coverage had been a blow to his ego, but beneath it was something more insidious. Fear. Not fear of Jamari's brilliance, but fear of what his rise could mean for Grimley's legacy. The man who had spent decades building a reputation on intellectual dominance now watched that legacy unravel in public, replaced by headlines that praised a child over him. Behind closed doors, Grimley began whispering to trusted colleagues, not accusing Jamari, but questioning the context. He didn't speak of mathematics. He spoke of control. He spoke of narrating. He cultivated a small group of skeptics among faculty and alumni, with language that hinted at overreach, that suggested the protest and media frenzy were more about optics than substance. He warned of perception over process, of disrupting academic tradition. In quiet corners, he framed Jamari's success, not as brilliance, but as institutionally induced spectacle. He was constructing a narrative designed not to confront the facts, but to undermine their interpretation. And it wasn't just in whispered faculty lounges. Grimley had quietly drafted a series of essays, not yet published, meant to question the structural implications of Jamari's work on long-standing academic hierarchies. These essays were framed as critiques of methodology and precedents, but beneath the sterile academic language lurked a much sharper edge, a smear campaign disguised as intellectual discourse. As word of this began to leak, first in low-level faculty circles, then through terse email threads, students noticed it, not because it was explicit, but because tone revealed intention. The language wasn't academic critique anymore. It was defensive, resentful, and increasingly personal. In Slack channels and group texts, students shared screen captures of phrases like disruptive narrative prioritized over discipline, and external forces reshaping academic authority. What disturbed them most wasn't the argument. It was the underlying message. Jamari's presence was a threat. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, momentum for the upcoming Senate hearing continued to build. Invitations had gone out to civil rights leaders, educators, members of Jamari's protest coalition, and even representatives from Harvard's Board of Overseers. The agenda to examine bias in elite institutions and propose legislative action for accountability and access. For Jamari, this was no longer about solving equations, it was about remedying systemic inequity at the national scale. But as the hearing date approached, the whispers of Grimley's campaign grew louder. His essays circulated among conservative think tanks and feeder networks, not as academic pieces, but as talking points, reframed to question the legitimacy of Jamari's achievements, and to cast doubt on the entire movement surrounding him. Suddenly, what had been a national narrative celebrating opportunity and equity was splintering, not into opposition over truth, but into opinion, skepticism, and manufactured doubt. And from the shadows of the academic elite, Grimley was readying his next move. At the stroke of midnight before the Senate hearing, a classified draft of Grimley's smear manuscript leaked online, not through protest channels, not through media outlets, but through a dark web archive tied to anonymous educational forums. The first line was devastating. Jamari Boone, example of manufactured genius or institutional propaganda. The question wasn't just rhetorical. It was about to ignite a new front of public scrutiny, and no one saw it coming. The nation was buzzing with anticipation the morning the televised debate was announced. Harvard, under pressure from months of protests, international scrutiny, and Senate condemnation, issued a public challenge. Jamari Boone and Dr. Walter Grimley would face one another in a live broadcast debate. It was cast as a test of rigor, logic, and academic integrity, meant to frame the entire saga as a pure intellectual contest. Cameras were set, lighting perfected, and the network billing promised explosive insight into one of the most talked-about controversies of the decade. None of the audience suspected that beneath the polished veneer of a televised showdown, real drama would be emotional, historical, and far more revealing than any equation on a board. Backstage, Jamari sat in a small green room, separated from the studio by only a curtain and a tense heartbeat. He had expected nerves. He had expected questions that would push him intellectually. But what he felt now was something deeper, a simmering undercurrent of obligation and resolve. He knew millions were watching. Students, mathematicians, politicians, families of color who saw their own struggles in his rise, and critics hoping he would falter. Somewhere in that vast invisible arena lay the emotional weight of representation, not just his own, but for countless others whose voices had been muted by tradition. Eleanor Rhodes paced beside him, eyes fixed to the floor at first, then on his calm, measured breathing. "You ready?" she asked gently, her voice the softest anchor in a storm of broadcast static and expectation. Jamari closed his eyes for 1 second, a momentary exhale. "I didn't come here to prove myself," he said quietly. "I came to expose truth." That thought had been his compass since the live stream that thrust him into the world's spotlight. He didn't need validation. He needed clarity for everyone watching. Beyond the curtain, Grimley stood in a tailored suit, not the confident man who once dismissed Jamari as a stunt, but someone weighed down by scrutiny, ego bruised and reputation teetering on national perception. His jaw tightened as he reviewed notes on a clipboard, phrases like methodological critique, academic precedence, and principled evaluation. He had coached himself to speak calmly, to avoid emotional language, to appear dispassionate, but inside, conflict raged. This was no longer a debate about mathematics. It was an attempt to reclaim a narrative he once controlled. The host, a composed journalist, known for sharp, balanced moderating, stepped between them moments before the cameras rolled. "Gentlemen," he said, voice intentionally neutral, "thank you for joining us. Tonight is about logic, respect, and rigorous discourse. Let's begin." The show went live. Millions tuned in worldwide. Social media feeds exploded with anticipation and commentary. On one side of the divided screen was Jamari Boone, youthful calm, eyes steady with thoughtfulness. On the other was Grimley, experienced, crisp, and attempting what he framed as a scholarly critique. The blackboard beside them stood blank, an empty slate ready to be filled with figures that could shape the narrative of a generation. The host opened with an acknowledgement of Jamari's solution to the decade-old problem, then turned to Grimley for the first challenge. What was fundamentally flawed in Jamari's assumptions? Grimley opened his mouth and began with technical language, citing historical methods, theoretical frameworks, and long-standing academic traditions. But his words, intended to build a fortress of critique, instead sounded defensive. Throughout his opening, the tension in his voice bore the strain of someone attempting to justify not just an intellectual position, but a wounded ego. Jamari listened, hands folded neatly, eyes respectfully attentive. When it was his turn, he didn't respond by dismantling Grimley's words. He reframed the entire context. Using logic clear and original, he explained why his perspective was not only valid, but necessary for advancing their understanding, and not a single line veered into performance. It was reserved, thoughtful, and true to the math he had lived with long before the spotlight found him. As the debate progressed, cameras repeatedly cut away to the live audience, scholars, students, and families who packed the studio. Expressions ranged from rapt attention to shifting discomfort. Some had expected a spectacle delivered by dramatic one-liners. What they were seeing instead was truth unfolding with precision and grace. Midway through the broadcast, the host asked a question that shifted everything. Does this debate represent just a clash of ideas, or does it reveal underlying biases in the way institutions define legitimacy? The audience held its breath. This was no simple academic query. This was the heart of the entire story. Grimley opened his mouth, hesitated, then chose his words with care. He tried to answer diplomatically, but each sentence revealed tension between defending tradition and acknowledging possible bias. It was like watching someone try to hold two incompatible truths together beneath a fragile veneer. And beneath the technical language was emotion rarely admitted into academic space. Fear, fear of change, fear of relinquishing authority, fear of losing control of a narrative he had once dominated. Meanwhile, Jamari didn't retreat from the deeper question. He spoke not only as mathematician, but as a young black man who had lived the tension between expectation and perception. His voice remained calm, but carried layers of reflection. Institutional legitimacy should not be measured by exclusion, he said. It should be measured by openness to truth. And truth doesn't belong to tradition. It belongs to clarity. That statement rippled through the broadcast with power. Audience reaction lit up in real time. Millions of viewers across the globe were moved, applauding in living rooms, sharing clips with captions like "Truth over Tradition" and "A New Era of Brilliance." But what no one expected next was not intellectual praise. It was emotional response. When the host turned back to Grimley, the professor's face flickered with something few cameras before had captured: vulnerability. He blinked slowly, chest tight, as though realizing that defending himself had become defending an entire system that might have failed a young genius. For the first time, his voice wasn't precise. It wavered. I respect the work," he said carefully, with a seed of sincerity. "But what I fear is not the brilliance you bring. It's the implications of redefining frameworks that have guided academic inquiry for centuries." The host gave him space to breathe, nodding. But the audience, both in studio and at home, heard something else: fear of change disguised as intellectual critique. Jamari didn't respond with overt triumph. Instead, he offered a reflection that was both poetic and grounded. If frameworks guide understanding, then evolution of thought enriches every framework. Brilliance isn't an intrusion, it's an expansion. At that moment, the live studio shifted. Faces softened, some nodded slowly, others stared, deeply moved, not merely by logic, but by the human quality that Jamari's words carried. But then came the twist. No one saw coming. Just as the debate seemed to slope toward a rare moment of reconciliation, a producer off-camera interrupted with an urgent whisper to the host. With an imperceptible pause that nevertheless registered immediately across millions of screens, the host acknowledged, and then, unexpectedly, announced a live audience question. This wasn't pre-scheduled. This wasn't rehearsed. A student rose in the front row, a black woman whose presence had been quiet until then. Her voice was steady, yet emotional. "Dr. Grimley," she began, "you taught us to question assumptions. Yet when someone outside expectations succeeded, you first erased him. How do you reconcile teaching open inquiry with sustaining barriers to it?" The room on both sides of the debate tilted into a raw silence. Grimley's face lost a bit of color. It wasn't anger. It was confrontation with accountability in real time. He opened his mouth, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, for the first time, his voice softened, almost involuntarily. "This is not about exclusion based on identity," he said, steadying himself, "but about maintaining rigor." "But rigor and exclusion are not the same," she replied. "When rigor becomes a shield for bias, it stops being a method of truth, it becomes a defense against it." A hush rippled, not awkward, not silent, but present, as if the truth in her words had filled the room so completely that air itself had nowhere to go. The host turned toward Jamari, nodding. He leaned in, eyes calm, and spoke with clarity. "Insight comes from inquiry," Jamari said. "Not just acceptance." And then, with an almost imperceptible shift in tone that only those watching closely would catch, he leaned toward the host and whispered, "He's about to make a mistake." The cameras caught that moment. The whisper, the glance, the tension that wasn't just intellectual but emotional and human. And as the studio audience exhaled collectively, and millions watched live, the world sensed that the debate was about to change in a way no one anticipated. What Jamari whispered wasn't about math. It was about a truth the world hadn't dared to confront yet. And as the broadcast went on, the next response from Dr. Grimley would not be about equations, but about identity, legacy, and the cost of truth. The air in the broadcast studio crackled with tension long after Jamari's whispered warning hung in the silence. What followed was not academic rebuttal, not defense, not another equation. It was a moment of unraveling. Walter Grimley, a man who had spent decades building walls around his intellect and reputation, now stood before millions watching live with something unfamiliar in his eyes. It wasn't fear of failure. He had faced failed proofs and peer criticism before. This was a fear born from the collapse of a carefully cultivated identity. The host, eyes wide with the weight of the unspoken tension, tilted toward Grimley. The camera stayed locked, capturing every minute micro-expression, every flicker in the professor's gaze. The audience, a global digital crowd, numbering in the tens of millions by now, waited with bated breath. Not for rebuttal, but for truth. Their silence was not passive. It was anticipatory, a chorus of expectation that had shifted from academic contest to emotional reckoning. Grimley didn't look at Jamari. He didn't look at the host. He stared straight ahead, at the blackboard behind them, where Jamari's solution still hung, not erased, not rewritten, but vindicated. It loomed there like a monument to clarity, a testament to what had been dismissed as impossible. And in that unspoken framing, Grimley felt not just defeat, but displacement. The spotlight he always believed was his by right had been reassigned, not because someone took it, but because someone earned it. He exhaled slowly, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every expectation he had ever held about himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin, measured as though plucked from somewhere deep inside him, rather than projected outward with academic authority. "I have devoted my life to inquiry," he said, "to the pursuit of truth." His eyes drifted toward Jamari, not accusingly, but vulnerably, as though he struggled to reconcile his words with the knowledge that the truth he chased had arrived through another mind. Jamari didn't respond immediately. In the quiet that followed, he seemed to absorb every gaze in the room, from cameras to audience members scattered before him, from the host anchoring every frame to the millions watching behind screens across continents. At 12 years old, he had experienced more scrutiny and emotional upheaval than many adults twice his age. Yet in this moment, he looked neither overwhelmed nor triumphant. He looked profoundly human, not a prodigy with answers etched in chalk, but a boy standing at the intersection of brilliance and recognition, shaped by every hardship that had brought him here. When Jamari finally spoke, his voice was calm but loaded with resonance. "Truth," he said, "is not owned by those who expect it. It is revealed by those who seek it." His gaze met Grimley's for a heartbeat, not in confrontation but in acknowledgement of shared pursuit, despite the way it had fractured between them. A silence followed, pregnant and full before the studio audience, once muted by anticipation, erupted into applause. Not polite applause, not restrained. A standing ovation. It began as a faint ripple in the front rows, building in momentum with every passing second, until the entire auditorium vibrated with it. Feet stamping, hands clapping, voices unified in recognition beyond ideology or allegiance. Somewhere in the front row, a student cried out, not in triumph, but in emotional release. "This is truth." Another voice, near the back, "He changed how we see genius." On screens across the world, viewers stood up in their living rooms, dorm halls, and offices, some with tears in their eyes, others with phones raised toward the television, as though capturing the moment might make it eternal. The standing ovation was not merely for Jamari, it was for the idea he symbolized, that brilliance could arise from places institutions had historically overlooked, that resilience and persistence could break barriers no matter how old the tradition. Grimley did not sit, he remained rigid, his face pale, gaze locked on the boy who had upended, not just a debate, but an entire epoch of perception. Months earlier he had tried to dismiss Jamari, deflecting truth through bias and authority. Now, in the electric resonance of collective applause, he found himself silent, not defeated by logic, but confronted by humanity. The host concluded the broadcast with a poised recap of the historic moment, not as victory lap, but as acknowledgement of a shift in cultural and intellectual tectonics. They spoke of systemic barriers, of bias unmasked, of a child whose work had not just solved a problem, but transformed a narrative. The words carried weight, not because they were rehearsed, but because they were rooted in real, human transformation broadcast in real time. After hours of live television, the cameras finally cut to black. Viewers across the globe exhaled, lingered, and stared at screens that no longer felt like mere glass and light, but like portals into a moment that had redefined possibility. Backstage, Jamari sat quietly on a simple metal chair, while the team packed up equipment with respectful reverence. Eleanor was beside him, eyes glistening with pride, and something tender, relief. They both knew that the broadcast was just one milestone in a much longer journey. But as they sat there absorbing the echo of millions of reactions streaming in through phones and tablets, it felt like history itself exhaled. Then someone approached, not a journalist, not an official, but a man whose presence was quiet yet unmistakable. He stood in the shadows of the backstage corridor, hesitated only a moment, then stepped into the dim light. He carried the weight of grief in his eyes. The face staring at Jamari was familiar, not from Harvard, not from protests, not from national broadcasts, but from a place that resonated deeper than any public narrative: the meaning of family. Jamari's breath caught. The man's face was marked by years of struggle and tenderness, wrinkles that hinted at laughter long absent, eyes that shimmered with both joy and disbelief. He wore a tired coat, shoulders slumped not from weariness but from bearing a lifetime of unseen hardship. And when he spoke, his voice was thick, not with accusation or anger, but with something far more fragile. "Jamari, my son." Jamari's heart didn't pound. It stopped. He stared at the man before him. A man with his last name. A man whose life had crossed paths with his own only now, at the pinnacle of visibility, after years of absence. There was a moment, a heartbeat stretched into infinity, where nothing moved except for the electric tension between them. The backstage noises dimmed. Conversations faded into negligible murmur. The applause from the studio seemed like a distant memory. Only these two figures remained: the boy who had rewritten equations and rewritten expectations, and the man whose absence had helped shape the resilience that brought him here. The man took a step closer, eyes glossy. "I heard your name on TV," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it was really you at first, but then..." His voice cracked, and for the first time Jamari saw raw emotion ripple through him. Not bitterness about lost years, but aching disbelief. Eleanor looked on, her face a mixture of cautious concern and empathetic awe, the kind reserved for moments too human to categorize. Jamari's mind split into two worlds at once: the moment of global consequence unfolding behind him, and a deeper, quieter moment unfolding right here, face to face with the man who shared his name. His voice, measured, thoughtful, tender, broke the silence. "Are you my father?" The man's eyes closed briefly, as though bracing himself against the weight of that question. When he finally opened them again, there was a truth there that transcended joy or pain, something unguarded and sincere. "I am," he said, voice trembling. "But I lost you before you ever knew me. I tried to find you. I never stopped looking." Jamari's breath felt like clouds hanging in winter air, visible, suspended, fragile. That moment of connection, father and son, broke more emotion than years of public acclaim could ever rival. It was private, it was raw, it was real. But then the unexpected twist that made every heartbeat in that backstage corridor shift. Before Jamari could respond, his father's expression changed, not with doubt, but with shock, and he reached into his coat pocket. With a trembling hand, he pulled out a crumpled Harvard letter. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a note of support. It was something very different. He unfolded the paper with visible hesitation, eyes flickering between the words, and Jamari's face. "This came to my P.O. box this morning," he whispered. "A message. It's from Harvard." Jamari didn't move. Eleanor leaned in, her gaze sharp with instinctive concern. His father's voice broke the balance of anticipation and dread. "It says, they want to meet with both of us. They want answers, and they want your signature on a document they claim concerns your future here." Jamari's pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with that old familiar shadow of institutional maneuvering. Harvard had opened a door, but this invitation, it did not feel like acceptance. It felt like another demand, and as Jamari unfolded the letter, eyes scanning the words that pulsed like ink-stained riddles, he realized the last line was not a customary sign-off. It was a condition. "Your future here depends on revealing the truth about your parentage." The paper trembled in his hands. His father's eyes met his, and in that silent, electric moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with him. As Jamari stared at the line that threatened to rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world, the overhead lights flickered, and a second previously hidden line appeared on the letter, glowing faintly as though newly revealed. "Failure to comply will result in revocation of all academic and public endorsements." What Harvard wanted next would not just challenge his identity, it would demand his soul. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you how often brilliance is buried under bias, then type yes in the comments. Do you think Jamari Boone would have been heard if the cameras weren't watching? Subscribe to hear the stories they try to silence. Because the fight for justice doesn't end with the truth. It begins with who's allowed to speak it.